Good evening. Throughout the day, candidates have been getting in their last-minute canvassing. Favourites last week were, of course, the goodies, representing the bouncing party. However, their appeal seems to be waning this week, particularly among the older folk who seem to be going for the less strenuous style of the waltzers. While we mustn't entirely rule out the chances of some of the more extremist groups, like the Max Walls. Anyway, for an up-to-date prediction of the outcome, over to Robert Mackenzie.
Swing to the left, swing to the right, honor your partner, and swing all night.
Thank you, Robert. The first result should be coming in any second now, which is for the highly significant seat of Hammersmith Palais.
And the real news here is the last-minute emergence of the only non-dancing party in the election. And there's the candidate now. As I'm sure is quite clear, this party advocate no dancing of any kind, in fact no movement whatsoever. And they are, in fact, quite literally standing for Parliament. There have been some rather unsporting accusations that they consist largely of plastic dummies. But their candidates have strongly denied this. Anyway, I have a feeling they could do rather well. We'll soon know, because here comes the returning officer.
The result for the constituency of Hammersmith Palais. The goodies.
Bouncing party.
312 votes.
Lots of spoiled votes, very hard to make a cross while still bouncing.
Sir Jonathan Peel.
Funky Gibbon.
3 votes.
He loses his deposit.
Mr. John I'm No Dummy Smith.
Standing party.
1,343,112 votes. And I declare Mr. John I'm No Dummy Smith is duly elected as Member of Parliament for Hammersmith Palais.
And they've done
it. This is Bristol. It's Friday. It's 5 o'clock. Actually 5:15, but welcome to Not the BCFM Politics Show on the 24th of May 2024, streaming live from the People's Republic of Stokes Croft Arts Centre in Bristol on the talkradio.org.uk stream and radioquk.com in Camberley, Surrey. Also live on the Not the BCFM Politics Show app, available free from all good app stores. That, of course, it doesn't include Apple or the Google Play Store. The best one, if you've got an Android phone, is called Aurora, which you can download as an app, and then it's got apps on it that are not on the Google Play Store too, and ones that Google haven't been censoring. Apologies for a bit of lateness, some technical issues. Thanks for hanging on. I'm Tony Gosling. Thank you for turning off the psycho in the corner, gaslighting us with its military-grade propaganda psyops, the puff pieces on the conspirators, and the hatchet jobs on the heroes, the McCarthyite witch hunts going after anyone with influence who speaks up for humanity, and against the World War III wage slavery lies. For those with eyes to see and ears to hear, the so-called solutions to every crisis, whether it's Gaza, Ukraine, COVID, migrants, farming, cost of living, climate, twisted accelerationist, Armageddonist policies designed to make every crisis worse. And the politicians, at least those in charge, as Manfred Petrich used to say, have nothing to say. So helping us navigate the World Economic Forum's fourth industrial revolution and World War III, it's Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers. Also joining me on the line from the Not the Andrew Marr Show is Crispin Flintoff. And we'll be looking this week, particularly at the general election. Last week we had, bizarrely, The Prisoner Free for All as our introduction music. That's the Mickey take of a general election going on in the village from the Prisoner series from 1969. This week, it's The Goodies Rule OK. So, in a way, what the theme of the show is pointing out some of these excellent satirical dramas about the farce that is the so-called UK democracy. We'll be asking why the election was called. We'll be also listening to Andrew Bridgen MP, the Conservative MP, ex-Conservative MP anyway, talking about, well, he did this amazing little bit of prediction, really, saying that we were already at war with Russia. And also we'll be hearing from the former BBC industrial correspondent Nicholas Jones about Wapping. He also talked to me this week about the Spy Cop scandal, because it turns out that many of the journalists reporting on the miners' strike were also being spied on in part 2. The death of Iran's President Raisi. Was he assassinated? How much support does he actually have in Iran? We've been told that this is actually quite a good thing for the Iranians because they don't really like him. Well, millions turned out to his funeral. I wonder how many would turn out to, for example, Boris Johnson's funeral, or Tony Blair's funeral, or Margaret Thatcher, for that matter. Also, the International Criminal Court arrest warrants have been sought for Netanyahu. And at the other court in Holland, the ICJ, Israeli war crimes, they've been ordered to stop in Rafah by the International Court of Justice. Finally, we'll be looking at Walter Veith. Did the Vatican create Islam? Well, we're not saying it did, but it's certainly a fascinating little exercise in showing some of the similarities between the Vatican and the Islamic faith. Iranian and Russian news banned in the UK, first by the telecoms cartel and then by Ofcom, and us cancelled off diddy little Bristol Community FM by the Bristol Mafia, but not cancelled here yet. Anyway, thanks for joining us, Crispin. Maybe you could just start by telling us a little bit about the not the Andrew Marr Show, because I tend to dip in there quite a bit. What you're doing there is, I think, charting the fight back, really, of the left wing in the UK, particularly in the Labour Party and George Galloway's lot.
Yeah, thank you for that intro. Yeah, well, I don't really know what I'm doing, to be honest. It's just something that's developed. There's a whole vacuum. There's people who are politically homeless, who were big supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, and the left generally. I mean, people who supported Tony Benn before him, people in that tradition, have no place in the Labour Party, and the smaller parties have not hitherto been much cop. So we've just been keeping everyone together on this weekly Zoom show that's also on YouTube, and we've just emerged as we are with this election being called, and people who are on the show, lots of them who watch the show, are standing as independent candidates, and a lot of them are getting into the idea of campaigning for independent candidates in all kinds of seats all over the country. George Galloway's victory in Rochdale inspired many people to believe that it's possible to beat the two main parties. And I think a little bit like 2017, there's this kind of atmosphere of let's give it a go, see what happens. You know, there's nothing to lose. We can't bear Starmer. We can't bear Sunak, obviously, as well. The Lib Dems, whatever. We've just got to do what we can to get ourselves out there and show people there's an alternative to the two neoliberal pro-genocide parties. So that's really what's going on.
But before we hear from Martin, can I just get your take on why the election's been called? It doesn't make any sense at all from a Conservative point of view. A lot of the Tory MPs, in fact, most of them have been saying, well, we want to hang on until November. We think at least by then some of these policies will be proven, if they're actually going to succeed. And it almost seems like a kind of sabotage of the two factions within the Tory party, the leadership. And we've had months and months now of Sunak sacking people and bringing in unknowns into the cabinet. For example, putting unknowns also into the jobs of the chairman and vice chair of the Conservative Party itself. So what's happened is we've got, I think it's now up to nearly 70 Conservative MPs saying they're not even going to bother standing next time. So this almost seems to be this snap election a result of a kind of throwing out of the toys out of the pram by Sunak, who's saying, well, if I can't have my way, well, I can call a general election and you'll all be gone.
It could be that, but also I've heard people saying that there's disaster coming up and he's got to get an election before that happens. There's something he must know that we don't know about. It could be the economy. It could be something to do with the scandal about the blood transfusions, the cost of that. I don't know. There's also this idea that the economy, because they're so boringly into this monetarism, that they've got to have the the purse has got to pay for everything and they can't borrow anything. That maybe they've realised they haven't got enough money and they have to quickly call this before they're found out that something's wrong. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, the Tories they're bound to lose, and his whole intro to it in the rain was so pathetic. It's just unbelievable what they're doing, really.
You know what? I think it, in a way, fits in with what I said in the intro about accelerationism. The idea seems to be to deliberately discredit any idea of our democratic leadership, to get people completely disillusioned with the entire system, and that seems to always be part of this whole process. Don't try to necessarily rationalise and untangle why he's done what he's done, which is so suicidal for the Tories. It's just part of the game that's being played with the poor old general public. But yeah, you know, let's have a listen now to somebody who said, and this is a few months ago, I think it was in end of March, beginning of April, the Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen, and here he comes up with what I think may well be one of the real reasons for this general election being called at this stage. Difficult to know, but it's an interesting prediction. So let's have a listen to, this is around about 4 minutes, and this is Andrew Bridgen, MP. He was kicked out of the Conservative Party, lost the Tory whip, and I think it was something to do with Palestine. I'm not even absolutely certain. What was it, Martin? Come on.
It's to do with his anti-vax views. I'm not quite sure what about them has caused him so much effect.
Oh, I think he said something. It was actually, well, in a way, it's both, because it's. He said something about this is the worst crime against humanity since the Holocaust.
Yes.
So there's anyway. So Andrew Bridgen probably won't win and won't be an MP in the next government, and of course that's another purpose of a nice early general election. Lots of MPs, dissident MPs right across the spectrum, including Jeremy Corbyn, we'll be hearing from in a minute, going to be out of the way. So here's Andrew Bridgen's take from March about the political situation in the UK.
Rishi wants out. We are actually at war with Russia now. We've got. They haven't told you.
So say that again.
We're actually at war with Russia now. I met with Andrei Kelin, the Russian ambassador in London, a couple of months ago, and he said that we know that your people are firing those Storm Shadow missiles at us out of Ukraine because you couldn't train the Ukrainians to do it. We know you're doing it, and I mean everybody knows that there are lots of US. UK, French. The French are in there.
I thought it was the Brits were down on the ground and special advisors.
Yeah.
Training sessions and teaching them and showing them.
Isn't that how?
But they were apparently. That's how we started with the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Dude, what the f*** are we doing poking the bear? That's really stupid.
They're determined to get us into a war with Russia, and thank God we've got someone in Putin who at least has got some brains.
Now you sound like a Putin lover.
Well, I'm not. I'm not convinced any of them are any good. But at the end of the day, if you look at the facts, since 91, we've moved NATO 1,000 miles nearer to Moscow. They haven't moved nearer to us.
No, they haven't.
And if you think about what we were trying to do, the EU wanted to bring in Ukraine for whatever reason, and NATO wanted it, and they'd have put missiles on the border of Russia. Well, I mean, what did America do when the old Soviet Union tried to put missiles in Cuba 90 miles off the Florida coast?
Yeah, exactly.
They weren't having it, were they?
No.
And if you look back, the Russians have told us for long enough, Ukraine's got to remain neutral. You know, we're not going to let it get them. They've told us this for a very long time.
So hold on one sec. You said Rishi wants out, and then
Rishi doesn't want to be Rishi's told the generals he doesn't want to be a wartime prime minister.
Really? So who's calling the shots? Is it the generals or the prime minister or someone else? Because
it's someone above Rishi. I mean, you don't really think that Rishi and Starmer. I mean, the whole thing's a pantomime in Parliament.
So I keep saying
it's a pantomime.
So I keep saying,
oh no, it's not. Oh yes, it is.
I keep saying that our political system, we have this illusion of democracy. It's BS. It's a uniparty system, and they're puppets. And there are people pulling the strings. Is that what's happening?
That's what's happening. And the next general election, I now realise, and I was beguiled by it for years. I mean, I've won at 4 elections as a Conservative. The next election is none of them. It's not a race between the blue and the red team to see who crosses the finishing line. This is a baton handover. On all the big issues, net zero, COVID response, the WHO, the trans agenda.
Who's pushing it then? Who's pushing it? Who's pulling the levers?
It's Agenda 2030. It's the World Economic Forum, the 0.1% of the richest people in the world.
The globalists?
The globalists, yeah. The people who listen, to make money, all we'd need is next week's newspapers today, wouldn't we? Well, if you own next week's newspapers, you know what's going to happen and what's going to be reported, regardless of what the facts are. And that's the position these days.
So we're heading for war.
And also, yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Well, we're actually already in it. They're not going to tell the people probably till July or August. Maybe a bit later. And I think Rishi wants out.
But hold on one second. I mean, if we go to war with Russia, we're talking about potentially nuclear war.
I know. It goes against all our defence thinking.
But even
we have nuclear weapons, so that no one would do that to us. So why would we do it to someone who's got 20 times more 30 times more nuclear weapons than we've got?
And not just that, their air defence capability, the S-500, I mean, it's a million times better than what we've got. We've got nothing compared to that.
We've got nothing that can stop any of their...
What is it? We've got Arrow or something?
I've seen a report that we just do not have any defence for the UK against the Russian arsenal.
Because you know they've got hypersonic missiles.
Yeah.
We've got nothing against that.
Nothing against that.
So that's the MP Andrew Bridgen speaking back at the end of March. So that's what 6 weeks or so ago. His main theme, Martin, here is that actually we're already at war with Russia and that Rishi has had enough.
Well, I'm surprised to find that I actually agree with him. I don't know whether it's because Rishi's had enough. I think there are lots of nasty things in the pipeline, obviously, and Starmer has been penciled in to manage British capitalism by the real movers and shakers, and of course the reality of the world beyond our shores and even within our shores for many people is there's a massive crisis which is just about to blow.
Crispin, what's your thoughts on what Bridgen had to say there? And he also tries to pin the blame on the World Health Organization, the Agenda 2030, the globalists. But I would like to have heard NATO added to that list. Anyway, what do you make of Bridgen's little prediction there?
Well, God, it's really hard to live thinking there's all these agendas above us going on like that. Maybe that's why people are in denial and would call that conspiracy theory. Because, if we feel we're so used in this way and sort of messed around by politicians who aren't even running it. I mean, he said they're both just puppets, Sunak and Starmer. It makes you feel powerless, doesn't it? And I don't know, and then you don't know, and then you go into stuff like, are they watching everything I'm doing, my phone, my laptop, etc. It's hard to answer that question, really. I think there's definitely dark forces in play, but we don't have enough evidence, perhaps, for this. I don't know. I mean, I don't really want to put my foot in it.
No, okay. Well, that's fine. I mean, the fact is that there is some pretty strong evidence, Martin, isn't it, that the British are firing these Storm Shadow missiles.
Oh, that's quite clear.
This sort of thing, and those have been sinking Russian naval ships. Now, if there were, a bunch of Russians on the Isle of Wight sinking naval ships in Portsmouth, I don't think there'd be any question about the matter of war.
Well, when David Cameron the other day said that he was happy for a new shipment of missiles, the British missiles have already been used, the Storm Shadow missiles have already been used in firing at Crimea, for example, which, of course, from the Russian point of view is really Russia, whatever the disputes about other parts of the Ukraine. And Cameron, the Americans have said that they don't want their stuff to be used to fire directly into Russia proper. Cameron, for whatever reason, thinks that the British can second-guess the Americans, and he said, well, you can use our stuff to fire into Russia proper. And the British ambassador was immediately called in Moscow and told, if your missiles, and we know it's your forces that are firing those missiles, fire at our bases in Russia, we're going to fire back, and we won't necessarily be firing back at you in the Ukraine. Your bases in Britain will be attacked. That's what they said. Now, of course, the general population are blissfully unaware of all of this because they're too busy worrying about the Eurovision Song Contest and who's going to win the Euros and all the rest of it, or even who's going to win our general election. But the decisions like this about going to war are the most consequential decisions any society ever makes. And yes, we're just sleepwalking into this. The Russians have spelled it out to our ambassador. If you do that, we're going to hit you. And most people are blissfully unaware that that's what the situation is.
Maybe we are actually at war with Russia. They just don't want to tell us. I suppose that's one way you can start. I mean, back in the day, there used to be these big declarations of war, didn't they? And it seems almost everything since World War II has been at least begun, Martin, as a kind of covert war before it becomes an open war.
Well, because of the existence of nuclear weapons, you've had all of this kind of, strategy now revolves around doing all sorts of other things short of declaring war and going to war. I mean, that's why, the Putin...
Assassinations, things like that. They tried to make like accidents.
Zakharchenko, who was the elected Prime Minister of the Donbass Republic, was assassinated in 2017 by a bomb in a light fitting in a restaurant where he was going to have a meal. And that was carried out undoubtedly by the Ukrainian SBU, probably working with MI6. And so a lot of these attacks inside Russia have clearly been carried out by Western intelligence services. That's what the Russian intelligence services are saying. But of course, for the general population, if the Russian intelligence services,
we don't actually get to hear a lot about.
Well, that's
what
right. We don't find out what the Russians think because we don't need to know what they think. They're just bad, and that's all we need to know, isn't it?
Yeah, I noticed. I think it was in it the. Prime Minister of Slovakia this week. I think it was yesterday. Up on the RT website.
He's in hospital.
No, not the guy who was assassinated. Another guy.
You mean the Deputy Prime Minister?
Deputy Prime Minister. Was saying that he'd actually got a phone call whilst he was on a phone call with someone from the European Commission. He's posted this on his social media, and it's big news over there. That the European Commissioner threatened him, saying, "Well, look, if you don't behave yourself, you're going to end up like your Prime Minister." So, Fico. And so this is the sort of thing that may be going on behind the scenes. It doesn't really get reported. This is being reported to the Russians in other parts of the world, but it's not really been reported much here. Anyway, look, we've also heard the announcement today, Crispin, that Jeremy Corbyn is going to be standing as an independent in his constituency, most likely Diane Abbott too, next door. In North London. Right. So what do you make of whether wisdom? They have obviously made a decision. They're going to stand as independents rather than join up with somebody like George Galloway's party.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I was worried Jeremy wasn't going to put himself forward at all because I thought his loyalty to Labour might be such that he wouldn't do that. So I'm really pleased that he's decided to stand as an independent, and it will give other people a boost who are doing the same thing. Maybe Diane Abbott. I'm not sure if she's declared that yet or not, but I think the Workers' Party have been flexible. They're not standing in some seats. They're certainly not standing against Jeremy Corbyn. They made that known. They're not standing against Andrew Feinstein, who's standing against Starmer, and they probably won't stand against Diane Abbott as well. So they're flexible on that. I think the advantage of having a party behind you like the Workers' Party is you have a logo. You also have more money to spend nationally as a party than you do if you're an independent, and you have a legal support from the party that you might not have if you're an independent. It might be difficult for some independent candidates to work their way around the paperwork and what they're allowed to do. So it's an advantage to some of these candidates to link up with the Workers' Party, but I don't suppose Jeremy needs that. So you're saying he can win, you think? Jeremy's going to win. I'm sure he'll win because he'll have so many people who come and work for him. And the candidate who's come in that they've just selected, I don't think anyone really knows them. And they look like one of these sort of shiny suited, pointy-shoed Starmer Starmer-Boyd type characters. So I can't see them beating Jeremy. He's built up a big reputation. He's been an MP for since 1983, isn't it? So I mean that's a long time to. I can't see anyone beating him.
So this is maybe Martin going to be a little bit like Ken Livingstone being thrown out of the Labour Party and standing against the Labour Party as London Mayor back in the noughties.
Yeah, I think I agree with Crispin that it's good that Jeremy is going to stand, and I think he's done his best to try and keep within the Labour Party. I'm still a member. And I think his tactics have been, we're not going to just walk away from all that trade union money, for example. People think that they can just do politics with no resources.
So do you think the Labour Party will have to, like they did with Ken Livingstone, have eventually to go, OK, you can come back now then?
I don't know.
Because he successfully stood against them and beat them.
What happened when Livingstone stood against Frank Dobson was that Dobson was just defeated. And at that point, Blair was weakened to some extent, and he basically said, well, we'll have to have you back in. I don't think Starmer is going to have Corbyn back in at any price, but he'll still be a member of Parliament for Islington North. And, of course, the real problem for Starmer is, on the current opinion polls, especially if he starts peeling votes to the left, is he won't get an overall majority. And he may well then have to talk to John Sweeney in Scotland about forming a government.
Almost certainly, I think that's going to happen. But look, before we hear from Jeremy Corbyn himself, speaking earlier, let's just look at the elections since 2010. We had the Conservatives sweeping to power, well, not really, but with the coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, standing against Gordon Brown, who'd taken over from Tony Blair. So that was when the Conservatives first arrived. Then there was another sort of Cameron election, successful one in 2015. Then there was this crazy thing that happened. We were a bit of a kind of wild card called the EU referendum in 2016, which was narrowly won by the Brexiteers. And that caused all sorts of ructions. And Theresa May, who was by then the leader, because Cameron had left because of his failure to back the right cause in the Brexit referendum, she called a very peculiar general election. I think it was in May 2017, anyway, middle of the year sometime. It was a very strange thing to have done. That was extremely surprising, but she'd been advised, if you call it now, you're going to win. And then she did various really silly things, like announce something, a death tax, which took 20 points or so off of, like, overnight, off of her Tory support, and all these Tories started thinking we're going to vote up for others. So it was a very narrow election, which Jeremy Corbyn, Martin, nearly won, didn't he? Actually did very well. If it wasn't for forces within his own party trying to stop him, he almost certainly would have won that. And also, of course, the mass media is very right-wing and was against him, and it was trying to frame him as a terrorist. There was a series of terrorist attacks across the UK. And so, by rights, if those terrorist attacks, which many believe were actually created by the security services, not necessarily our own either, maybe, in collusion with foreign security services, plus the press, plus the undermining the Ford report revealed within the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn should have been PM at that point.
Well, he missed out under first past the post by maybe a few tens of thousands of votes. It's like you'd have to look into it in detail. But, of course, he still wouldn't have a majority in terms of the popular vote. And I think, you see, we're having this discussion here about what kind of politics we can have in this country. But in a country like Spain,
we're not in Spain.
No, we're not. We're not in Ireland either, Tony.
Crispin, can we just get a point of view from Crispin about Jeremy's chances at that 2017 election if he hadn't been undermined in different ways?
I think Jeremy would have won if it had gone on another week. The campaign. I mean, it was an incredible turnaround. If you look at the polls from the start, I think he was about 20% behind at the start, and he got to right up on the edge of winning. So, yeah, I mean, it was a fix in the sense that the media was supporting the Tories. And the Labour Party internally, as you've just said, were fighting against Corbyn. But the unbelievable number of people campaigning on the ground, I mean, I'll never forget it. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people in each constituency going out knocking on doors, and it made a difference. I mean, that almost makes my eyes water thinking about it. Such an incredible election, and that's the sort of thing we need so much, and it's where people believe in a democracy. People kind of believed in that democracy then.
They did. 2019 was the next general election. That was caused because of the stalemate in Parliament about with too many anti-Brexit people trying to stop the Brexit deal going through. And in 2019, that election campaign, Martin, was really quite incredible, with Corbyn leading the Labour Party, and I can remember very well, even here in Bristol, we had these Corbyn rallies, which were more like rock concerts than rallies. The various people had tried to, I think it was in Owen Smith or something, tried to stand against him, and there's like 3 people would come along. When Jeremy Corbyn came to speak, there'd be thousands of people there, and like Crispin's saying, it was people were getting quite emotional. Look, this guy really is going to change things. You know, he's actually bucking the trend.
Well, as a long-time supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, I'm not going to disagree with any of these things. But you're up. You know, the system doesn't easily give way.
The system is the Labour Party. Actually, in this case, is the Labour Party undermining Jeremy Corbyn, trying to make sure he doesn't win the election, even though he's their leader.
Yes, but that's because the infrastructure of the Labour Party isn't necessarily dominated by the membership.
No.
Don't forget the trade unions fund it.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite a Byzantine piece of kit. I mean, don't forget when Ed Miliband beat his brother David Miliband to become the leader, he won it by having more votes in the trade union section of the Labour Party conference. And then, because there was then a lot of moaning on the right wing of the party that this was a trade union fix, so he said, well, what we'll have is one person, one vote elections, which are actually quite a new thing in the Labour Party and in the Tory party. We never used to have them years ago.
Anyway, Crispin, what do you make of that 2019 election? Because largely Corbyn was said to have lost it, mainly because he just refused to back the Brexit referendum wholeheartedly, and he had this kind of shilly-shallying approach. There were lots of accusations of anti-Semitism too, but I'm not sure people really believe them. They just wanted to make sure that that the whole Brexit thing was gone and done with and finished.
I think it was the Brexit thing. I mean, I despaired of the way that he did well in 2017, and then his advisors put him in suits, tried to make him look respectable in Parliament, and made him sort of play the safe policy line all the time. And somehow the safe policy line was supposed to be a kind of compromise on Brexit, which was not at all what was not going along with the democratic vote of the referendum. So it was a disaster, and I could see it coming. I could see the result coming from sort of 2018. I could see that happening, and the person who really sabotaged it was Keir Starmer, because he was pushing for this referendum on Brexit, and that was his undoing. And now to see Keir Starmer saying he's a Brexiteer, I mean, Keir Starmer is just the most untrustworthy politician I can think of for my life. I've never known anyone in my lifetime is untrustworthy.
Well, there's some people now saying, Crispin, I don't know if you believe them, that actually the one thing that the Labour Party's not allowed to talk about, nobody is allowed to, and they're under very heavy manners, is this idea of rejoining the EU once Labour wins.
Well, he's clearly going to try and do that in some underhand way. You know, this man is allied, as you've sort of been talking about before, these global agenda stuff. He's one of their players. He's a member of he was a member of the Trilateral Commission. He said Davos is where all the politics is. He'd rather be there than in Westminster. He's just doing what he's told. So in a sense, what Andrew Bridgen was saying is right. I mean, especially with Starmer. And the mission was to get rid of Corbyn and get rid of all the people who support him and make the Labour Party into something that's, you know, they can just manage. We've got to fight this. In this general election, everyone has got to fight this agenda that we are just minions and we'll do what we're told. We've got to fight it, and I'm going to do what I can. You're just reminding me of all these elections, but it's quite frustrating to hear. But then again, the 2017 one is a real inspiration to me, because there were so many people who just thought, we'll give it a go. Doesn't matter what the polls say. We're going to go out and do what we can. And I really think that's the spirit we've got to have.
Well, maybe. And it might not necessarily be the Labour Party that gets that popular support and the people out on the streets. It might not be. Anyway, let's have a listen now to Jeremy Corbyn speaking earlier today. This is around about 4 minutes of him announcing that he will be standing against the Labour Party in Islington.
I was first elected to Parliament for Islington North in 1983. And in all those years, we, the community, have had many, many campaigns. We've defended and supported the Whittington Hospital. We've prevented the widening of Holloway Road and construction of a motorway through North London. We've achieved great things like Gillespie Park. We've had a lot of council housing built. We've achieved some fantastic victories together. And that is what being the local MP is all about. I believe in democracy. I want our political parties to be democratic. But members of Islington North Labour have been denied the right to choose their own candidate. And alongside that, the community as a whole has been disempowered because of that. So we have to stand up. We have to stand up and say, we're not taking this anymore. We will assert our rights. That's why I'm standing to be an independent candidate for the people of Islington North. This country has become more divided than ever. There are more people living in desperate poverty than I've ever known. There are more people using food banks and more families wondering how on earth they can make ends meet. Young people who can't get anywhere to live, people with children living in a very overcrowded place, people in the private rented sector facing high rents and insecurity. We're not going to end any of this without fundamental change, fundamental redistribution of power and of wealth, public ownership of water, mail, energy companies. Other countries manage to control rent and control the private rented sector. Why can't we? And a health service that isn't the plaything of global corporations trying to take it over, but is our health service for us. These fundamental demands are not being presented by the official opposition at the moment. Yet they are the demands of millions of people all over the country. We need a politics that represents an alternative to the horrible, corrupt, arid years of this Tory government. Whoever the Prime Minister is, I'll be holding them to account. Holding them to account on child poverty, holding them to account on hunger, holding them to account on health, on jobs, on the environment, on global issues of peace and justice. That is what an MP should do. And that is what I've done and will do. And I hope that those people that have always supported Labour, and indeed are members of the Labour Party, will understand that I'm here to represent and serve the people of Islington North on the same principles I've always had as the MP for this area. This is going to be a campaign with an awful lot thrown at us. I'm ready for that. And I know everybody else is ready for that. We will stick to the policies, to the issues, and to our fundamental humanity. 40 years ago, I promised the people of Islington North that I would fight for peace, for justice, democracy, and fairness in our society. I say it again. That's what I'm going to do.
So that's the former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, now ousted as Labour MP for Islington North, speaking earlier today, announcing that he's going to be standing as an independent. And we've just heard from Crispin Flintoff, who's joining us on the line, the presenter of the Not the Andrew Marr Show every Sunday, which is a sort of political, left-wing political programme that asks the questions that you will never hear Andrew Marr asking, saying that he thinks that he'll win. So the idea of the whole of the sort of left being split, do you think there's ever going to be any kind of resolution to this, Crispin? You know, do you think that the egos of Jeremy Corbyn and George Galloway will ever be dissolved enough for them to be in the same party again?
Well, I mean, I suppose those two are getting on, and they're not the future really. But we do have a problem with there's a problem in that on the left we like real democracy. We want everyone to be heard, but then that often leads to nothing happening because everyone's discussing what we're going to do and they never do anything. And then you have someone like Galloway who's a leader, and then everyone's fed up because he's a big ego and they say all these things about him like that. He's a big ego or whatever. We need to have something in between where we do things. We have action, but we also are democratic and bring people with us. And that's what's lacking at the moment. I can only... all we've got to do is know that we're right. Our ideas are right. What we're fighting for is right. And I think that something will emerge. Someone will emerge. Something will emerge. And we've got to have hope that that's the case. It's a process of, in a way, knowing that the Labour Party isn't the vehicle anymore. With respect to anyone in the Labour Party, I don't see how the Labour Party can be a socialist party the way it's run, and I think if people can accept that and we can somehow move on and set up a new party, possibly on the back of hung parliament with PR being brought in. That's what I'm hoping for, that we get a hung parliament and somehow or other they have to do a deal with the Lib Dems or someone else, or other parties like the Greens or whatever, to get a PR system, and then we can all sit in a party quite happily. But I think the first past the post system is very difficult to work against unless we destroy Labour, and that's possible. But if you look at just to sort of on that subject, in France, the Socialist Party has disappeared now, so. That these things do happen. Parties do disappear, and new parties come forward. We might not be in a good position at the moment, but we will be. I think in the future, maybe before I'm dead, but maybe not. But we just got to keep going.
Well, I largely agree with that. The problem with the political system in this country, it was designed in the 18th century to embed oligarchic rule.
What difference is PR going to make?
I'll tell you, the difference in Spain, for example, is everybody can sit in their own party. And there's a party to the left of the mainstream
socialists. So you're saying
socialists.
the people who get elected keep swapping about?
No, they don't. Because in actual fact, you can sit in a party. You can have there are left-wing parties in Spain. The to the left of the Socialist Party, which is pretty left-wing compared to our Labour Party, and they've got 15% of the vote and 15% of the seats. And the leader Yolanda Diaz is a Communist Party member, but they lead that particular party list. Now, this is normal stuff in Poland, where I used to live. It's normal stuff. It's in France. They do have a first-past-the-post system, but you get 2 rounds. So you end up with a situation where in the second round, the National Front never got anybody elected, because even if they'd done very well in the first round. But at least you don't get the perversity we get in this country and in the US, where people with less votes end up running the country. Thatcher never got 50% of the vote in this country. In any other European country, she would never have been Prime Minister at all. But even leftists like ourselves presume that she had this charisma and that she managed to win people over. She didn't. She was defeated roundly at every election she stood in. But the first-past-the-post system, which keeps the Tories in power, kept her in power. What's interestingly happening on the right now is with the people shifting to reform, what was UKIP, that's going to take a big chunk out of Rishi Sunak's vote. And if you split the vote like that in a first-past-the-post system, you lose. That's how Bobby Sands won in 1980 in South. I'm
glad you brought up reform, because they're our next clip here. So I'm starting, of course, with the fringe parties. Like the Jeremy Corbyns, the George Galloways. For me, they're far more interesting than the Uni Party. Maybe before we hear from Anne Widdecombe from Reform, Crispin, you could tell us what you think of this whole idea that really it's. The whole idea of Labour versus Tory, Labour versus Conservative, is kind of yesterday's way of doing things. That it's more actually about, the politicians that either honest politicians that speak from the heart, or corrupt politicians that just read out a script.
It's corrupting. Westminster's definitely corrupting. So you know, I don't watch Parliament at all now. I think I did when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, but I can't watch it. It's so cringing. The kind of the speeches they make are so insincere. Everyone is so insincere. I mean, some of these independent candidates that I've interviewed on Not the Andrew Marr Show are unbelievably genuine. You just kind of think, God, if that person was elected to Parliament, just one of them would just be incredible. So there is this problem that our democracy is more and more people are just thinking there's no point in it, and that's dangerous.
Yeah. Well, we had, was it a 15% turnout in our local elections for Hartcliffe? It was a tiny, in one of the poor areas in Bristol. I mean, people are just walking away from the polls. And not only that, they're being forced away, Crispin, aren't they? Because they of this old voter ID. They're turning up to vote and being told if you haven't got the right paperwork, you're not allowed to vote. You've got to prove you are who you say you are.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an attempt to stop people being political. And for me, as someone who came into this kind of political stuff later in life than a lot of these people who started with searches or whatever, it leads to depression. If you don't believe that you have any agency, that it's all done by people above you and you can't change anything, then you don't think there's much point in anything in life because you can't do anything. So in a way, that's why I reacted about the Bridgen thing, because it felt like I can't do anything about it. It's all been set up by some other people. I believe we have to be our own agents in this society, or we might as well not get out of bed, because it's a really pathetic, miserable existence to think you can't do anything. So. Yeah, I mean and they win. They win if we don't believe we have any power. Yeah. They win all the time.
They do. If the idea is really just to get people apathetic. It seems to me that's actually part of the programme. Get apathetic, and then the fascists can move in without any trouble. Anyway, let's have a listen now to Anne Widdecombe. Quite interesting to see her rolled out as one of their big policy people in the Reform Party. I mean, it's unlikely that they may. I mean, they're going to eat into the Conservative. We'll be here from Martin and Crispin after we've heard from Widdecombe about the role of reform eating into the Tory party in a similar way to Galloway will be eating into the Labour vote.
The crucial issue in this forthcoming general election is going to be immigration and the impact that it is having. The published figures have now come out for the year ending in December 2023, and they are a migration, and this is legal migration, strictly legal migration, 685,000. Nowhere near the 200,000 that we had been previously promised. 685,000. Now, at first glance, because the 2022 figures were 764,000, it might look as if there has been at least a slight decrease. But what we have to remember is that the 2022 figures were revised not once, but twice upwards. We began by being told, just as we are being told the figures now for 23, we began by being told that the figures for 2022 were 606,000. And after two revisions, they ended up at 764,000. So it's therefore reasonable to conclude that the 685,000, which has been published today, will be revised and is likely to end up as substantially more. Now, having been in government and having been in the Home Office and having been, admittedly a long time ago, immigration officer or immigration minister, I know very well that immigration has a tremendous impact on the country. There is no such thing as an economic movement which doesn't impact right across the scale. And immigration has a big impact on our health services, on housing, and it has an impact on the general infrastructure. And we, at 685,000 net, are actually looking at the population of Manchester. So the population of Manchester come into this country in a single year. If we look at gross migration at 1.2 million, it is going to require a huge amount of housing. I think Richard will be telling you that it will be something like a new house every 2 minutes, which we certainly aren't doing. And a huge impact on health services, both local and regional. And that is what we are now facing, and that is why uncontrolled immigration is at the root of so much that is going wrong.
That's from the Reform Party, Reform UK, Anne Widdecombe, speaking, I think, on Thursday after the announcement was made on Wednesday of the general election. Quite amused to see the technical interruptions to her speech, which I was trying to listen to live and couldn't listen to at all. But this is an issue that it doesn't seem as if the Conservatives have done anything at all, really, to stop the migration, does it? And that's the main reason people voted for Brexit, surely, is to stop this mass migration. And as she's saying there, it's we're talking now still around about 750,000 people a year. There's a city the size of Manchester turning up on the British shores, Crispin.
Well, I mean, I don't really know the facts and stuff on this. I don't meet. This might be my bubble, but I don't meet many people who are talking about migration. So I might not be the right person to ask about this. But I don't think that Reform Party has proved itself to be very popular in recent by-elections. For example, in Rochdale, where I went up to look at the campaign, that they were very, very low in the vote, and they were almost saying they're the second, they're running against Galloway. It's Galloway or Reform, and they came, I think, about 5th or 6th, which, if they're trying to build up this issue of migration and also sort of Islamophobia is part of it. I mean, it does often come with that. I just think they're failing. I don't know. And also, I sometimes read that migration, the costs of it, she's talking about how much it costs, that a lot of these costs are actually the other way around, that the people who come to the country produce a lot of wealth, pay taxes, work in the NHS, etc., etc. I'm sure we've all heard those arguments to counter what she's said. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not, as I say, I'm not someone who hears about there's too many migrants coming over. I would have maybe said I heard that a bit more 10 years ago, but I don't hear that very much now. Yeah,
there was quite a bit of talk about that. And also, what you've got with Reform, it seems to me, is you've got a party which is very much propped up by their media empires like the Murdoch Empire and Talk TV, where Richard Tice has had his own programme for many years, as Isabel Oakeshott, his wife, has also been supported by. So it's almost as if this is a sort of private media political party that's pushed into the limelight much more than it actually deserves. But anyway, let's have a listen to Nicholas Jones. I spoke to him. I was due to speak to him about Wapping and the print union disputes in the 1980s, because he was an industrial correspondent for the Times newspaper and the BBC there during the time. And so you may well recognise, older listeners may well recognise Nicholas's voice, but I pinned a question on to get his thoughts on this snap election and why he thought it had been called this week. This is former BBC industrial correspondent, now retired, Nicholas Jones.
I was surprised, but not totally surprised. I think there's no doubt when you look at the sort of what's going on behind the scenes is that clearly he realizes that stringing this out to November could make it even worse for the Conservative Party. You know, the public's patience with it all is rapidly running out. I think, too, he's got problems within the Conservative Party. You know, it is a very unstable political party with a lot of politicians who are sort of determined to have a sort of, you know, leadership parade, and this could all go on in the summer months. And then there's the bigger unknown as to what might happen on the economy. And I think Rishi Sunak, who I judge as a sort of very capable technocrat. I mean, he's very good at making sort of technical decisions, whether you agree with them or not. He makes them and you know, has a strategy. Whether it's working again, that's another question. But he is a good technocrat. And I think he must have looked at this and thought, look, it would be much better for me to go now and call everyone's bluff, catch everyone off by surprise, and go for it now, because I think he's got a sort of a bit of the wind behind him. And I think that they realised that if they hung on and hung on and hung on, it would only get worse. That clearly was what happened to John Major in 1997. You see, he hung on and hung on. Everybody thought he was going to go earlier, and he didn't. And of course, by hanging on, there were more scandals in the Conservative Party. There was more trouble. They were in the middle of privatising British Rail. Then there was you know, they were getting rid of the nationalised industry in British Rail, and that was the final act of the major government, and they hung on to complete it. But you can see that it got even worse as the months dragged on. It became even more likely that the Tories were going to be slaughtered. And I think that probably Rishi Sunak, if he looked at his spreadsheet, could probably see when he came to weigh up the balance sheet that the risk was better to take the risk now than to hang on to a fag end in November.
Yeah, well, maybe he was looking at computer models. Who knows? Anyway, what about the Labour Party these days? It's a very different institution to that which did all this nationalisation after World War II and carried through the sort of fight against privatisation, isn't it?
That's right. Well, it's a completely changed party, isn't it? I mean, one has to look at the way, and of course this is always one of the things that is fascinating to me, is that you see, when we saw how of course after Neil Kinnock lost the election in 1992 and he resigned, we then had John Smith as the leader, as the Labour leader. He died suddenly and Tony Blair took over. But once Tony Blair took over, and once, you know, there was this sort of mood about him that everybody thought, well, he's a bit of a winner, he could pull it off. Everything sort of coalesced around him. And again, of course, the Conservatives were coming out of 18 years in government. It's even more now. It's less now at 14 years, but even so, it was a hell of a long time. And I think there was no doubt about it that everything sort of began to sort of coalesce around the Blair machine. And one feels the same thing has been happening now, that perhaps the momentum between Rachel Reeves and her approaches to big business, or Wes Streeting with his ideas for the National Health Service, perhaps they are helping to sort of create this wave I hate to use the word enthusiasm. That would probably be decried by some, but certainly there's a positive wave behind the Labour movement at the moment. They really seem to think that they've got ideas and plans that could actually benefit the country, and they're determined to have a go. And I think once that sort of momentum builds up, it does become, you know, a pretty formidable election fighting machine. And if we compare it with the Conservatives, you know, they are a clapped out thing, whereas the Labour Party are really on the go. And, you know, I think we have to look at it in that way. Yes, the Labour Party has changed, but we have to say, and I'm looking at it as somebody, I think I'm on coming up to my 16th general election, you really do feel the momentum behind the Labour machine.
So almost no need to ask you who your money's on. But look, what about your expertise, though, which is in looking at industry? I mean, the country is very much in the doldrums in terms of, for a lot of people, young people starting work,
their first job sometimes doesn't even get them out of poverty nowadays.
No.
Well, that's even with two people working in the same household. So is there anything that these parties have got to offer in order to restore people's finances, their hope in the future, ability to invest in, buy a house for their kids and that sort of thing? Because all that seems to have gone, and we seem to be getting now a lot of messages from our political parties, which are sort of negative messages saying, well, we will save you from the Russians, we will save you from the terrorists. And there just seems to be very little actual vision.
Well, a bit of a correction there. I mean, if you take housing as an example and the determination of Labour, to unlock these years of planning disputes, to take tough decisions on what they call the grey belt. That's where the green belt around the big cities has been eroded away and where house building should take place. I live in North London. We're surrounded by sites where there's been a failure to develop. Now, if Labour came in and started a massive house building programme and it really took off, there's no doubt the house builders would be for it because, the things would really take off. And that could, help transform things. What was so significant, especially to me, having covered the miners' strike, was the sort of almost sense of collusion. What we have to understand is that Mrs. Thatcher had won the miners' strike. The police, yes, whatever you might say about Orgreave or complaints about brutality, but the police had held the line. There was no doubt about it. They had corralled the miners. They'd been unable to carry out what they threatened that they wanted to do. And the same happened at Wapping. So the print workers valiantly picketed the Wapping plant. But what we saw was a very slick police operation. And what happened was that Murdoch, you see, had really thought this through. So in the early 80s, newspapers were still taken around the country, printed in London, and often taken by overnight trains out to the distribution centres. He had already arranged for that whole job to be overtaken, and he was going to introduce road delivery by a big firm called TNT. So the newspapers were now being printed at Wapping. So you've got the Sun and the Times. They would be printed, and massive lorries would head out of Wapping through the picket lines and take the newspapers around the country. So he'd completely bypassed the previous system for the distribution of newspapers. That was part of Murdoch's success. And, of course, the print workers tried so valiantly to stop this, but they were no match for the police. We saw mounted police yet again. And I was struck so much with the similarity with the miners' strike. You see, when you think back to the miners' strike, the police were in control. Those buses taking working miners, they all got through and took the miners into the pits. And it was the same in the Wapping dispute. When it came to the crunch, all of those lorries got through. There was never a day that Murdoch lost the newspaper production. And in my own mind, we have no evidence for this, but it's pretty clear that the police, had heard it from on high from Mrs. Thatcher, as we know happened in the miners' strike. Look, you've got to do all that you can to make sure that the print unions aren't going to win this one. We want the newspapers delivered. Murdoch's got every right, in the government's view, in Mrs. Thatcher's view, to get his newspapers out for sale. And, of course, we have to remember that the Sun and the Times were very, very big supporters of Mrs. Thatcher, as, of course, was the News of the World and the Sunday Times.
There is another aspect to this, because I can remember interviewing a few years ago Dennis Pater, who worked here on the Bristol Post as a journalist back in the 1970s. And he said that the change from hot metal up to the new digital printing works was it wasn't just a technological change. It was also a change in working practices, because he described to me how when he'd finished a story, he would get a call from downstairs once they'd actually set the story in hot metal, and he would then stand next to the printer just a few feet away, read his story in reverse, and he wasn't actually allowed to get within arm's reach of the printing machine.
No.
But the printing unions and the journalist unions had arranged this, whereby the journalist would check. He'd have to read it all backwards because it was all in metal and about to be used to print the story. And then he'd sign a little, on a clipboard, a little piece of paper saying, yes, that's my story and it's all correct. And this was a way of ensuring that the journalists actually made sure that they got their exactly what they'd written onto the page and into print. So something changed, didn't it? With this
That's
technology, right. It wasn't just the technology; it was also the ability of journalists to ensure that exactly what they wanted to write was going to appear in the paper the next day.
Yes, you didn't have that same degree of oversight because, of course, the whole point was, and this was the Murdoch Revolution, I described, you see, how I used to have to type my stories on a typewriter, on a piece of paper, and literally hand the piece of paper to a messenger. I was at Westminster, who would then take it to the printing works. So I didn't have oversight of my stories, but our chief sub-editor from the Times room at the House of Commons went down and looked at the page and checked all the stories. But of course, what happened with the computerized revolution is that you put your story into a computerized system, and of course, it pops up along the way. Other people are changing, amending. I'm putting the words in quotes, manipulating the story before it actually gets into the paper. And you're right, the journalist has lost control. Once he presses the button and says, I'm signed the story off as it is on my screen, that doesn't mean that's what's going to get into the paper.
That's Nicholas Jones, former BBC industrial correspondent. Did the unions get it all wrong in the fight against the miners? So anyway, Crispin, if you can stay with us another few minutes, how are you doing for time there?
I'm okay, just about.
Yeah, okay. So I wonder, I mean, one of the things that Nicholas talks about in the longer interview, which will be up on thisweek.org.uk on our show page later on this evening, is he explains that he thinks that the Labour Party is going to win, maybe as a coalition government in this general election, that really this is an act of sort of hara-kiri for the Tories. I asked him, I pressed him, what do you think is actually going to change? And he seemed convinced that on housing, the Labour Party was going to really make some difference in getting more houses built. So what do you make about that? Do you think there's going to be, under Labour, an improvement in housing or in anywhere else in society? Just trying to set aside some of these concerns about Starmer and his links to the globalists, the World Economic Forum, and people like that.
Well, no, I mean, I've gone through this. The education when I speak to people who support Starmer, they say education, he'll improve. There's no evidence of that. The academisation of schools, the privatisation effectively of education will continue with Labour. The Ofsted powers will still be there. And university students, it was emerged yesterday that they might have to have a higher loan than they've got now because they can't afford to live anymore. The NHS is going to be, there'll be more private outsourcing. There'll be more outsourcing of the NHS, which means that more public money is going into private companies. And the idea that we're going to sort out the NHS is a big myth. They're walking around with their sleeves rolled up in hospitals as if they're surgeons, and that they're going to prove that means they're looking after us. That's nonsense. Housing, well, they're talking about more home ownership. So they're talking about more people being in debt to to companies throughout their life. They're not talking about any social housing as far as there's no social housing being talked about. They're talking about building on the green belt as well, which isn't really necessary. There's nothing that and underneath all that, the economic policy is exactly the same as the Thatcherite monetarist policy. It's talking about how much money we've got to spend in the purse. It's all nonsense. The Labour Party in power, a Labour government would be worse than a Tory government, if you want my opinion.
Why do you, so, I mean, it's a pretty extreme from someone of your political bent. What makes you say that?
Well, because of his foreign policy, especially the fact that Starmer will do anything the US says, and his connections with the global agenda, I think that makes it more likely that we'll have in Palestine, for example, we'll have worse situation there. We'll have a problem with Iran going on. We'll have more Ukraine issues going on, and that's bad enough for me. I just don't see any domestic policies being any better under Labour. They are simply the same as the Tories. So in many ways they're the same, but in some ways they're worse. And they will probably do things a bit like with Blair bringing in student loans, students being massively in debt. That was Blair's thing, and we trusted Blair to come in and do the right thing, and then he did that. I think Starmer will bring in some really, really nasty NHS stuff, privatisation on a scale we have never seen before, because we are supposed to trust Labour with the NHS. I think we'll be deluded by that. And we'll end up in a worse situation. So I do think a Labour government would be worse than a Tory one, but obviously I don't support either.
Okay. Well, it's interesting, isn't it, with the hospitals and the schools and the universities under attack in Gaza, to see them here under attack too in slow motion. Martin, what do you make of what Crispin's saying there? Actually, Labour could be even worse for the domestic, for groups things like the NHS. I mean, particularly what they've been saying, and I've noticed this under the Tories, is they're saying we're spending more. But what's happening is there are all sorts of their mates have got contracts, IT contracts and things like this with the NHS, which aren't actually helping patients at all.
Well, I think when Rachel Reeves said, the Shadow Chancellor said I think she was in Liverpool, and she said, well, what we've got to accept is that we maxed out the credit card and there isn't any money, which is exactly the monetarist fallacy. It's simply not true. And I think what they're going to run up against is that this attempt to manage capitalism by doing what the bosses want, basically carrying on the same policies as has been suggested. They will try to do that, but even if the Tories won, they're still going to run slap bang into the biggest economic crisis of the 21st century. And in actual fact, their sums won't add up for reasons that they can't possibly discuss. The blowing up of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, clearly carried out by the US, although the Russians think the British were involved, that has actually wrecked the whole of the European economy. Yeah. We are now going downhill.
They're blaming the Russians. They're all blaming the Russians for the hike in fuel prices, which is simply not true. But I'm trying to stick on housing for a minute.
I know, but I mean, the point is, if you're that dishonest about the fundamentals of the economic situation, then what's going to happen is they're probably going to win the election, and then the crisis will break. And then, of course, they will have to deal with it, but they're in no way prepared to do the necessary things.
Yeah, it's certainly the most dishonest.
There's going to be blood all over
the most dishonest and corrupt election that I've ever seen in this country in my lifetime. But on housing, I'm a member, I must have my hands up and confess here, of a little group called Acorn, which did a national action last Saturday against the TSB. I think it was 30 or 40 locations across the country in synchronicity in all these banks. Acorn moved in with tents to protest these clauses that the TSB have got in their buy-to-let mortgages, which force landlords to review rents every 1 year. Now, other banks like Barclays and Lloyds and people like that do have these clauses, but they're every few years, not every year. And we heard as a victory straight away. The TSB announced, yes, we will take these clauses out. So, but anyway, I did have a chat to a chap called Wesley Bear, who we've had on this show before, about what the purpose of this action was here in Bristol last Saturday and around the country.
My name's Wesley. I am the branch secretary and executive committee member for Acorn Bristol. We're here today to demand that TSB scrap their buy-to-let mortgage clause, which limits landlords to renting out to tenants for 12 months. Now, we think it's disgusting.
But surely after 12 months, it's just a rollover tenancy.
Well, it opens up the tenant to anything. Rent increases, potential for the landlord to turn around and say, I don't want you in the property anymore. There can be a renegotiation renegotiation, but yeah, it's also going to cost the tenant more. I mean,
isn't this normal? Most banks do.
Most banks have a clause like this, but TSB is a year, which is significantly less than... I mean, the next one after TSB, I won't name the bank, but it's 3 years, you know, so that's, you know, about 2/3 more, you know, which is ridiculous. But you have to kind of think about how short a space of time a year is. Let's say you move into a place with a new partner, you get pregnant, you spend 9 months pregnant, you have a new baby, and then a month and a half, 2 months later, you've got to then renegotiate, worry about money or worry about finding somewhere else to live.
Okay,
you know?
So how does Acorn hope to change that then?
Well, we want it scrapped. It's as simple as that. We want that clause totally gone, or at the very least to emulate other banks.
Do you think TSB might listen?
I think they should listen. I think they listened to us 6 years ago when we had a campaign against one of their other clauses in their buy-to-let mortgages.
Tell us about that. Was that successful?
It was a successful campaign, yeah. I wasn't a member of Acorn then, so I can't give you all the details. But yeah, it was a successful campaign. We won that. They got rid of the clause, which is why I'm confident that we're going to win this campaign too.
Okay, so this is just in Broadmead here. What about other campaigns around the country?
Yeah, well, we're in Broadmead now, which is one of 2 TSBs in Bristol. There's another branch in Bedminster which we're also occupying, but then there are 31 other branches up and down the country that are being occupied by Acorn this morning as well. So a massive nationwide action that will increase if need be.
So that's Wesley Bear speaking to me outside the TSB in Broadmead on Saturday, and there was the police turned up. It's supposed to close at 1 o'clock, the TSB. We had people in there sitting there with tents playing games and things like that in the bank, but not stopping anybody actually going to the bank. It was the bank themselves that decided, we don't like our customers having to look across at people playing games on the other side of the bank. So they themselves apparently decided. But anyway, I spoke to Laura, who was doing the police liaison on Saturday.
Bank staff called the police down because they wanted us to leave, but they stayed in the back for most of the day. So really inside we've just been playing board games. It's been quite relaxed. We've made a big effort to make sure that customers can still access the bank and still feel safe to do so. But unfortunately the bank have been turning away those customers themselves for unknown reasons. So the police have come down, and then the police liaison officers have came to speak to us. So they then got the bank manager to formally ask me to leave the premises because they want to close, and once that has happened, the police have told us that we can then be arrested for aggravated trespass. So we made the decision to leave the branch, and we're just going to stay outside, still doing this action and talking to the public.
So yes, Laura there, but I did actually have a chat with a chappie that just wandered. He was in the bank. I think he wanted to do something, but the bank said, "Oh no, please come back another day. We've got people in here." Even though they could have done, they were being a little bit awkward. And so he was talking about the change that there's been in his lifetime since the 1960s in the cost of housing and just how much of a headache it is.
The youngsters haven't got the same chance that we had. We had it was difficult to get a house back in the day, but
You're talking about the 60s, or
yeah, the 60s. Yeah, it was difficult. I could have bought a house for £1,500 or £1,300. Yes, seriously, it's a joke, isn't it? I could have bought a house for £1,300, and I was in a rented accommodation. Prior to that, and I was paying £2.50 a month. I think I'm not sure if it's a week or a month rent. I can't remember now. And rent, and we had a little bit of a dispute because it was a shared bathroom, and she ended up wanting me to sell. She wanted to sell me the house for £4,300. And that's a 5-story house. This is unbelievable. I mean, I'm pretty sick now because I would have bought it with a sitting tenant. So consequently, I didn't want to buy it with a sitting tenant. So, and I'm blowed. I was out of it 6 months, and the tenant that was in there had gone and moved anyway. So if I would have bought it, I'd have been. But that's the difference. I mean, all right, my mortgage then was £38 a month. Over 21 years. And I said to my wife at the time, I said, we won't be moving until the house is worth £14,000. It cost £7,000, by the way. And consequently, within a couple of years, it was up around £16,000. You know, it's a joke, isn't it?
Yes, it is a joke. The housing bubble. Martin, do you want to say something about this? I mean, he's saying there that this is when it was all kind of kicking off in the late 60s, early 70s, I guess. He's saying he bought a house for £7,000 within a couple of years. It was doubled in value. So this is becoming a fantastic place to speculate with your money.
Well, that's right. And it encourages people to speculate with their money rather than investing in small enterprises, for example, which is what happens in other European countries where they don't have this property bubble mentality.
So, Crispin, what do you make of the crazy situation with housing? I mean, it's lovely to hear from somebody who actually found he could pick and choose, really, a nice cheap house to buy for his family back in the late 60s and the early 70s.
I mean, yeah, I don't really understand home ownership at all as a concept, because people, this generation, I think I can't remember what letter it is, but there's a generation that resents the fact they can't own a home. And I can only see home ownership as something that keeps you in debt and constantly worrying about the mortgage rate.
Yeah, well, something's changed, hasn't it? I mean, he's talking there about paying his, what was it, £38 a month interest on his home. And over the space of a couple of years of that mortgage, the building has doubled in value, so he's made a fortune. I mean, everything is kind of basically turned on its head, hasn't it? It's become a complete and utter nightmare actually buying somewhere now.
Well, that's what I mean. The buying somewhere seems to me to be the problem. I think if we went back to private rental or rental just with a fair rent, then everything would be probably manageable. But people seem to want to own things because Thatcher put that in their heads. I mean, my parents never owned their house for years and years. I mean, there wasn't any stress about having to own it. After the war, I don't think anyone thought, oh, I've got to buy the house. They just thought, well, I just got a nice place to rent. Thatcher's put that in people's heads, and people, even left-wing people who are sort of meant to be really ahead of the game, still obsessed about owning their homes. But
I mean, hang on, because Thatcher didn't put it into that guy's head back in the late 1960s. He's just looking at it as a sensible thing to do. You know, if you're
I understand that, but I'm just saying generally it's become like everyone thinks they should own their home or they're not secure. But you're not really secure if you own it because you still owe money. So there's a kind of it's just a sort of legacy of Thatcherism, really, that the culture of home ownership. I know it existed before that, but it wasn't that many people who bought their homes then, before her. I mean, I think it was about 70% of the country was renting before.
Well, I think there was a big kind of what you might call a home ownership explosion after the Second World War, which by the time of Margaret Thatcher really started ending. But anyway, we also had on Sunday, this past Sunday, we had this brilliant event called Bristol Transformed with a chap called Nick Korkos, I think he is. His book is called Against Landlords, and they were discussing kind of what you're saying there, Crispin, which is, why not rent? If you can manage to make sure that you've got security of tenure and you can't be evicted, this is a good thing. So let's have a little listen to what Nick had to say at the panel event at the Trinity Centre here in Bristol as part of the Bristol Transform Festival, which I might say was fantastic. There were hundreds and hundreds of young people mostly, but all sorts of ages, talking about every kind of left-wing, mainly left-wing issue that you could possibly imagine, including I wandered past a whole discussion about the Spy Cops scandal with the police infiltrating environmental groups and actually steering environmental groups and having kids with environmental activists, and that was a fascinating chat. Even though I only heard a few seconds of it, I mean, well, should we say 20, 30 seconds of it? There was loads going on. But here's Nick talking about his book Against Landlords.
Abolishing landlords is some sort of fantasy. Can you talk about how we were close to doing that in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I can let you into a secret. We're all friends at Bristol Transform. But when I first started thinking about the book and pitching the book, and it was going to have one of those titles, like Abolish Landlords or Abolish Rent, and at the time I thought, it's a bit pat, it's a bit ambitious, it's a very typical left-wing book. And then I started writing it, and I was like, my God, we nearly did it. We came within a whisker. And there was a point in the 70s where not only was landlord decelerating, but the rate at which landlordism was declining was accelerating. And everyone was perfectly happy with this. And it meant that there were more homeowners because landlords were desperate to sell up, and there was more council housing because local authorities were buying those houses from the landlords at bargain basement prices. And it also meant that there wasn't such fierce competition for land, so local authorities were able to acquire more, they were able to build more. And everyone on the left and the right was perfectly happy about this. And like that was the world we could have lived in. That was our future. That was the promise of a previous generation. That was cruelly taken away from us. And Thatcher we blame, but of course we blame Blair as well, both for the kind of macroeconomic things he did, but also for the very real things that he and his wife did in the city by popularising buy-to-let as a kind of student investment, by taking the homes that people in Bristol could be living in and landlording them. That is a world in which they created, when we could have been living in a world in which landlordism had all but disappeared. And I think what's like positive about it is that after the Second World War, landlordism as a proportion of housing stock was about 60%. By the mid-70s, it was down to 6%. So it took 35 years for that to happen. It's now taken 20-35 years to ramp it up again. If we started tomorrow, we could easily abolish it within our lifetimes.
6%.
6%, yeah.
So the number of dwellings per capita is just shy of the OECD average, but it feels like we only hear from supply guys. Is it as simple as building more homes?
Yeah, no, it's not. And there was a tweet thread doing the rounds over the weekend. The Financial Times' data this guy called John Blair Murdoch something, wrote a piece about homelessness in the UK, and the UK is leading the world in homelessness by some margin. It's about 50 households per 10,000. Its nearest competitor is roughly half that, roughly 25. The US is less than 20. And he started the piece being like, we all assume that the US is kind of the homelessness capital of the world, but in fact it's Britain. A huge number of those people live in temporary accommodation, and some are genuinely sort of street homeless. But then, so he had this bar chart at the start of this piece, and then he had another bar chart further down that showed that Britain builds more housing than the US, and Britain started off with more housing than the US. And you just think, you're the FT's data guy. If you put two of your own bar graphs next to each other, you would understand that building's not the problem. But of course, he didn't put them next to each other, so he thinks that building's the problem. We have comparable levels of housing stock to many other OECD countries. We somehow managed to lead the world in homelessness. So it's not really a supply problem. And as the left, as Marxists, we need to be in the business of asking better questions rather than just pandering to this undersupply rhetoric.
So that's Nick Bano, B-A-N-O. He's a barrister, Garden Court Chambers in London, one of the top chambers. His book is Against Landlords, How to Solve the Housing Crisis. Martin, in a nutshell, is it feasible to get back, to make it so that there are no landlords, effectively?
Well, I'm inclined to believe him, but you've got to want to do it. I mean, of course,
none of these two is what you're saying are going to do it. No?
Well, I mean, what happens with a lot of this stuff is on a ratchet. So things that would be thought of as totally unacceptable, like selling off the council housing stock at less than its actual value to existing tenants and then not building any more, that ultimately has a long-run effect, not just on people's homelessness. It has an effect on the economy as well, because it means that we're prone to inflation and house price inflation, which means you've then got to put the brakes on. And this is why the British economy has got poor productivity. It's because we spend all of our money on bricks and mortar and not on other things. And that's because of the use of housing as a political tool to manipulate the political situation.
Yeah, I mean, it was a fantastic event over a whole of last weekend, the Bristol Transformed. For me, it was the highlight, actually, hearing this whole thing about housing and that actually it is possible to turn it round. And what Nick Bano is trying to do there, Crispin, is to try and start a political movement in a way it's to get people to stop being so depressed and disillusioned about politics and say, actually, we can sort this out.
Yeah, well, that sounds great. I mean, it feels sometimes like there's too much that we're up against, but sometimes the small initiatives like this can build movements. So yeah, it's definitely worth pursuing. And I kind of agree with everything he said. Yeah.
One person that I'm starting to hear from again, which does worry me, I get the collywobbles when I hear from Alistair Campbell. We've got this kind of team, Crispin, haven't we, in the background, where most obviously Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair running a lot of the things that are going on in the Labour Party. So I put a little graphic out a few weeks ago saying, vote Starmer, get Blair.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, Alistair Campbell is definitely advising Starmer, and I mean, how you can have Alistair Campbell, Mandelson is obviously is advising Starmer. How you can have Mandelson in your team when we know all we do about him just shows something is very...
What do we know?
Well, we know his links with Jeffrey Epstein. That's well documented. And also we know that he's been working for some of the worst kind of dictators and leaders in the world. He's well into this sort of globalism movement. It's a shady political party that's being advised by Peter Mandelson. There's no question about that.
He was called the Prince of Darkness, I seem to remember, by some journalists even when I was working and he was around. But anyway, he was saying Alistair Campbell was one of his little protégés who should be behind bars. He was one of the people who was most definitely involved in the death of Dr. David Kelly. And he's the one that was involved in changing the so-called dodgy dossier. And covering up the legal advice, which there had been that the Iraq war was illegal, which was actually reinforced by GCHQ whistleblower Catherine Gunn and the United Nations itself by not approving the illegal invasion, Tony Blair's illegal invasion of Iraq, which Alistair Campbell was one of the chief architects of. So it's interesting to hear him popping up again as somebody that's going to be helping lead the new Labour Party and advising them at the very least.
You will know about something called the Queensland strategy, which was a strategy operated in Australia, in Queensland, where the incumbent, who everybody said was going to lose, basically did the message, don't give these guys a blank check, don't give them the landslide that they think they're going to get. And guess what happened? The landslide never happened, and they lost. Now, that's unlikely this time, but I certainly think if you combine that with apathy and general cynicism about politics, is a problem. So Labour should be taking the lead in saying, we have got to fight like we can lose this, and they've got to then show that. I think on the second point, stuff will go wrong. Stuff will go wrong for all of the parties. Stuff will go wrong that will irritate them. I think what Keir Starmer has shown in his leadership, and it's so interesting if you think about it, if we were having this conversation after the Hartlepool by-election a couple of years ago, the general feeling around Keir Starmer was this guy can't win. And now we're going into an election where people say this guy can't lose. Now, you're right that it's a problem on one level, but it's a better problem to have than this guy can't win.
That's a very good point. Let me ask you about the guy who's the brains behind the campaign right now, Morgan McSweeney, who we both know. He seems to me to be one of the really formidable street fighters of modern British politics. And one of the things he has done is focus the Labour campaign intently on the seats that Labour has to win. This is going to be the most targeted election campaign probably ever. How do you see him as a tactician, and how do you think his input is going to play out?
Well, I think that you're right that this is going to be a targeted election. All elections, parties have limited resources and they have to put them where they think they can work best. And I think what was interesting was in the local elections and the mayoral elections, they were doing it almost like a dummy run.
Yeah.
So they were, and I was getting messages from some people who are in the Labour Party saying, Jesus, we just had a message, we've got to move from here because we're going to go there. And that would be because real-time data would have been analysed and people were being moved around to places where, there was a better chance of winning. And the Liberal Democrats are going to do a smaller scale version of that as well, inevitably. So I think that's obviously smart thinking. And I also think, by the way, that one of the possible reasons why Rishi Sunak went for this earlier election is because the Tories probably do have to, at this stage, have a financial advantage, which the party conferences would have probably upended, because Labour was standing to make a lot of money out of their party conference from business. But listen, Morgan McSweeney is a big part of Keir Starmer's operation. He has been right from the word go. And to repeat the point that they've gone from can't win to can't lose is down to the strategy that they've pursued.
So that's I will call war criminal Alistair Campbell, who's been part of this new government. And also this guy Morgan McSweeney, Crispin. What do you make of what he had to say? That was the real Andrew Marr Show. Well, you do not the Andrew Marr Show. Right. What do you make of this idea that this team of Mandelson, Campbell, Blair are going to be sitting behind the scenes pulling Starmer's strings?
It's terrifying, but I mean they're all experts on what human beings do. They all know what we're going to do. They all predict how we're going to behave and what makes us tick and everything like that. They've got such a low view on humanity, all of them. They dismiss us so badly that we need to show that we're not these robots that they think we are. That we'll do what they say, and how we'll be manipulated by the most kind of nauseating videos of Starmer talking about his mum being a nurse, his dad being a toolmaker. It's those experts, as they call themselves, won an election in 1997 because people were fed up of the Tories, and they lost their share of the vote in every election after that. And they will probably, if they do, they'll win an election because people are fed up with the Tories again, but nothing to do with the quality of Labour. So, and they get paid fortunes for looking credible and speaking in sound bites and this stuff. It's appalling that we haven't progressed from 1997. That we've still got the same people hanging around with this young pretender, Morgan McSweeney, who says he said, I'm an expert in winning elections. It's not, politics should not be about manipulation of the public, but it should be about inspiring people and getting people to believe that the country can be better and leading a country to a greater society. It's so appalling that we've got politics like this still. And I've got to go, but I just want to say that this election could become the most bang your head against the wall election of my lifetime, but it could, if we just put two fingers up, it could become something totally different, and it's in our power to change that.
Before you go, just briefly, I mean, this is a tripartite group of warmongers and successful war criminals that took Britain to war back in 2003. Looks like they could be coming back. We've already heard from Andrew Bridgen. We're already at war with Russia. Maybe that's what this is about, is there's somebody is going to be put into place in order to take us into the next war. This time it's not going to be with Iraq, it's going to be with the Russians.
Oh, God knows. Well, we've got to stop it. We can't have it. We can't have another war. Sod Mandelson, sod Campbell's, and certainly sod Blair, and Starmer. I mean, he is the most annoying politician. He's just so annoying, and we've got to do what we can to stop that man getting into power.
Okay, so can you give the listeners an idea of how they can tune in to Not the Andrew Marr Show on Sunday, please, Crispin?
Yeah, if you search Not the Andrew Marr Show, there's a website, and you can sign up to watch the show on Zoom every Sunday morning. It's at 10:30 till 12:30. We do like this show, which I think is really entertaining. We go through lots of different things, different stories. This Sunday we're focusing on how we can make sure these independent candidates win. So if you're interested in that, please join up and let's do it.
So is it more like The Prisoner, where they have an election and Patrick McGoohan stands to be the leader of the village, or is it more like The Goodies, where the plastic models get elected in?
I know I'm too young for The Prisoner, but I remember The Goodies, and I like the music. Bill Oddie used to make me laugh. So yeah, this is more like The Goodies then.
Okay, well I'm going to put a link up anyway on our show page to this amazing Goodies episode, which gave us a lot of entertainment earlier today watching that, a bit of it anyway. And it's called, oh gosh, I can't remember right now. What is it called? Not Vote For Us. Anyway, I'll put a link up to it on our show page at thisweek.org.uk, as well as to the Not the Andrew Marr Show. Crispin Flintoff, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.
Now, Martin, before we finish, we ought to just look at this aspect of war, particularly with Gaza, because we've had, in fact, just before we got this election announcement, which is one of the reasons I think maybe this is really about getting a war government installed. With Blair behind the scenes, people like Campbell, etc., who the establishment rather like because of the success in getting the illegal Iraq war going, is the announcement by the International Criminal Court earlier in the week, wasn't it, about requesting arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and his defence minister?
Well, obviously the Israelis are very unhappy with that, and Biden's already said it's outrageous. The International Criminal Court also, of course, called for the arrest of Hamas leadership. I mean, the International Criminal Court has always been a kind of bit of a football, really, because it was set up by the West, really, for the West's purposes. And the Americans refused to sign up to it because they didn't want to have any kind of judicial oversight of what they do. The Russians, for their own reasons, said, well, we're not signing up for this. But Britain did sign up for it. And Khan, who heads the International Criminal Court, has generally been, a pretty subservient to Western interests.
Just to make it clear, there's two different courts, aren't there? One is part of the UN.
This is the International.
So anyway, let's go back earlier this week and have a listen to what the International Criminal Court prosecutor had to say about the Israelis earlier this week.
I can also confirm today that I have reasonable grounds to believe, on the basis of evidence collected and examined by my office, that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant bear criminal responsibility for the following international crimes committed on the territory of the State of Palestine from at least the 8th of October 2023. The crimes include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering, serious injury to body or health or cruel treatment, willful killing or murder, and intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population, as well as crimes against humanity of extermination and or murder, persecution, and allegations of crimes of committing other inhumane acts. My office submits that these individuals, through a common plan, have systematically deprived the civilian population of Gaza of objects indispensable to human survival. We have reached that conclusion based upon interviews with survivors, many eyewitnesses, experts, from satellite imagery, statements from Israeli officials, including the two individuals subject to the present application, as well as based upon several hundred authenticated videos, photographs, and audio recordings, many of which were taken and shared by victims and eyewitnesses themselves. My office charges Netanyahu and Gallant as co-perpetrators and as superiors in the commission of these alleged crimes. Israel, like all states, has the right to defend its population. It has every right to ensure the return of hostages that have been criminally and callously taken. Those rights, however, do not absolve Israel of its obligations to comply with international humanitarian law. Intentionally causing death, starvation, injury, and suffering to the civilian population, including so very many women and children, are criminal means to achieve military and political goals. That's what we allege.
So this is pretty strong stuff. It was just announced the day before the general election was called. So do you think it could have had an impact? Apparently it sent shockwaves around Westminster. So I've heard from various sources that Netanyahu's going to, an arrest warrant's being issued for him.
Well, I think
he's crime minister, isn't he? Crime minister. We had those. This is one of the Jewish protests in London, and he's not only in trouble internationally. Some people want to jail him. There are also people that want to jail him in his own country.
Well, I don't think that's had much to do with Sunak's decision to call the election. So you don't think it's possible that the Labour Party is seen as a safer pro-Israeli pair of hands now than the Tories? Oh, they are safer pro-Israeli because they're going to win the election, and therefore
you've got a motive
they will be the British government.
You've got a motive there straight away.
Yes, but there's not a motive. You're trying to suggest that Sunak and Starmer are in it together to try and...
No, I'm trying to suggest that Sunak has lost the battle with his own party. He wants to support the Israelis. His own party are pushing back against him. That's not true.
Well, it is. Yes, it is. Most Tory MPs, Bridgen is definitely in the minority in the Tory party.
I'm not saying they're all like Bridgen.
Did you see Michael Gove's speech this week?
But there are all sorts of pressures on Sunak to stop supporting this genocide. You're not trying to tell me that all Tory MPs support the genocide.
No,
they certainly don't. Alan Duncan was one that's been pushed out, but there's others, and there's loads of senior Tories have been pushed out, and he's now, you're saying you can count them on one hand. That's just not true. There is a few now in the Conservative Party that Sunak, over the last year or so, including the chairman of the Conservative Party and the vice chair of the Conservative Party, and most of the cabinet ministers now, no one's ever heard of, because all of the senior Tories have ditched Sunak. Now, he's now in the position where he can't carry on, and his authority's gone. And so the only way you can have a British government which is going to continue to support this genocide is to bring in Labour to do it.
Well, it may be true that the Labour Party is going to continue to support the genocide, but I just don't think it's factually the case that Tories, either at MP level or at constituency level, are against what Israel's doing. In actual fact, they're out of step with the British public, and hopefully that's going to cost them, a lot of them, their seats,
and what about
including Labour.
What about Labour?
Labour, yes, some Labour MPs are going to lose their seats, as we saw in Rochdale, and that should be the case. I'm very much in favour of not voting for anybody who's in favour of genocide, just as a matter of principle, Tony. Okay? Now, the point is that Sunak is not being pushed out by the pro-Palestinian views of his party. His party are absolutely in bed with virtually all of them are members of Conservative Friends of Israel.
No, they're not. No, they're not. No, they're
well,
not.
Name me which MPs are pro-Palestinian.
We're not going to play silly games about naming a whole list of
wrong,
MPs.
Tony.
It's not wrong. You've got an equal number of pro-Israeli Labour MPs as you have Tory MPs.
No,
it's just that
it's not
Rishi
true,
Sunak has run out of pro-Israeli MPs in his cabinet.
The reason why he's going is nothing to do with the fact that he's being pushed by his own party to be more pro-Palestine. That's just an absurdity.
Well, maybe it's big business that's pushing him rather than his own party.
Well, big business.
Does the Conservative Party really have that much weight that it controls the country? I don't think so.
Well, they accuse the Prime Minister at the moment. That's how Rishi Sunak.
So where is Sunak's loyalty? Is it to the City of London or is it to the Conservative members or MPs?
It's probably to the City of London. Yes, and the City of London is very pro-Israel.
If the City of London and the King have told him, let's have an election now, then that's going to happen, isn't it?
Tony...
You really think Sunak's in charge?
No, of course he isn't in charge, Tony. I'll tell you who's in charge. It's the CIA. They've been running this country since the 1950s.
So maybe it's them that wants a change of government.
Yes, they do want a change of government. Yeah. You're right. Yeah. They want a Labour Party in power because the Tories are unelectable because of all the things they've done. So what they want is a Labour Party that's going to be a Tory party and will continue to support NATO in Ukraine and in
nothing to do with Gaza and nothing to do with Russia and Ukraine, no?
It is to do with Gaza and Russia and Ukraine.
Well, that makes my point for me, doesn't it?
No. The point is that the people in charge want the British British state to carry on doing what the British state has always done, which is support the Americans unreservedly.
Anyway,
with the same whoever we elect for. Galloway, not so much. Sinn Féin, not so much, but they don't take their seats.
We like to be fair on this programme, so it's let's give Benjamin... Well, two things. First of all, there were also 3 Hamas leaders indicted by the International Criminal Court on Tuesday, but also, what about Benjamin Netanyahu? What's he got to say about this idea that there's going to be an arrest warrant out for him, and many countries that he travels to, he's going to be locked up as soon as he steps off the plane?
The outrageous decision by the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, to seek arrest warrants against the democratically elected leaders of Israel is a moral outrage of historic proportions. It will cast an everlasting mark of shame on the International Court. Israel is waging a just war against Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organization that perpetrated the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Hamas massacred 1,200 Jews, raped Jewish women, burned Jewish babies, took hundreds hostage. Now, in the face of these horrors, Mr. Khan creates a twisted and false moral equivalence between the leaders of Israel and the henchmen of Hamas. This is like creating a moral equivalence after September 11th between President Bush and Osama bin Laden, or during World War II between FDR and Hitler. What a travesty of justice, what a disgrace. The prosecutor's absurd charges against me and Israel's defense minister are merely an attempt to deny Israel the basic right of self-defense. And I assure you of one thing, this attempt will utterly fail. 80 years ago, the Jewish people were totally defenseless against our enemies. Those days are over. Now the Jewish people have a state, and we have an army to defend our state. Notwithstanding the blood libels Mr. Khan has leveled, Israel will continue to wage this war in full compliance with international law. We will continue to take unprecedented measures to get innocent civilians out of harm's way and to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches those in need in Gaza. Mr. Khan also sets a dangerous precedent that undermines every democracy's right to defend itself against terror organizations and aggressors. The ICC has no jurisdiction over Israel, and Mr. Khan's actions will not stop us from waging our just war against Hamas. But Mr. Khan's abuse of this authority will turn the ICC into nothing more than a farce.
Well, it's lying liars lie, don't they? I mean, he doesn't like it, but it is significant that the ICC has done this. But of course, they've also arraigned Hamas. There's a very good article by Jonathan Cook this week, where he points out, who's based in Bristol, who used to be based in the West Bank in Palestine.
He used to be a Guardian correspondent.
Yes, he used to be a Guardian correspondent. And he points out that in actual fact there is no comparison between what Hamas have done and what the Israelis have done. Hamas, when they talk about hostages, a lot of the people taken hostage were military personnel. And don't forget, everybody in Israel, man or woman, serves in the military. There's not a shred of evidence to suggest that anybody was raped by Hamas on the day, or that they killed any babies deliberately. Most of the people that were killed on the day were killed probably by the Israeli Defense Forces and their Hannibal doctrine of trying to prevent people being captured. Now, the Israelis are now being forced into a corner, but I can bet your bottom dollar the Americans are threatening the International Criminal Court. They're threatening the people like Khan, saying, like John Bolton said when Trump was the president, we know where your kids live. That's what he said about the people at the International Criminal Court. So that's the attitude of the US towards the International Criminal Court and the Israelis. They're just scofflaws. But of course, what's really interesting is what Sunak or Starmer are going to say about this, because in actual fact, they have been complicit in this as well. And ultimately, of course, Biden, Sunak and Starmer should possibly go to The Hague as well to stand trial. But of course, they will not accept that. But that's where we're going. And of course, that is the view on the street in South Africa or Colombia, for example.
What's your view about this idea of Mandelson, Campbell, Blair being brought back for another war, this time with Russia?
Well, the establishment, the pro-NATO establishment in this country wants a stable government so that they can have these wars. That's what they want. And the Tories have become a shambles, and they can't actually, tie their own shoelaces. So what they want is a reasonably competent government if you'll carry on doing what NATO wants. And of course, even Jeremy Corbyn, when he was leading the Labour Party, didn't dare to suggest that we could leave NATO.
It just seems to me absolutely right what Andrew Bridgen was saying, that Sunak wanted out, and of course he was proved 6 weeks later. He was proved right. But I put a link up to that on our show page at thisweek.org.uk.
He won't escape indictment.
We're going to be talking about the president of Iran, Raisi's strange helicopter crash and death and funeral. And we'll be discussing whether that was sabotage or not, what we know about that after the break. And we'll also be having a discussion about the rights and wrongs of what's going on in Gaza. But before all that, our resident poet, Patrizia Opulenza, has something to say about the infected blood scandal. A vial of blood, the latest fad, pursuit of youth gone truly mad, plasma for the ageing crew, quest for youth, the latest do. Blood from strangers, all paid to give their plasma for the wealthy spivs. But what about the spikes now found in jab blood now swimming round? In their blood without the knowing, dreadful seeds of illness sowing, with all their wealth, don't want to age, to live forever, their latest rage. Of madness gone insane and worse, old age now seen as a dreadful curse. No thoughts to use their vast wealth for good, to lend a hand, most never would. Young blood demands a demon's endeavour, for fiends to live forever and ever. And you know what she's decided to talk about there, as one of the things that you might know about, is the super rich using blood of young people, getting it injected into themselves to stay alive for longer. What a lovely idea.
I forget to guide from the bottomless pit, but my aim was made strong by the hand of the Almighty. We forward in this generation triumphantly. Won't you help the sin? Of freedom is all I ever had. Redemption song, redemption song. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but to ourselves can free our mind. I've no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time. Our love shall kill our prophets while we stand aside and look. Some say it's just a part of it. We've got to fulfill the book. Won't you else to say these songs of freedom is all I from mental slavery. None but to ourselves can free our mind. Whoa, I've no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop off the time. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Some say it's just a part of it. We got to fulfill the book. Of freedom, that's all I He played it all day. I go, go, I go, go. He liked to dance to it down in the streets. He said he loved me, but he loved the blues. But when I sit down, I wrote it down. I could see it, darling, so why? I brought my baby a radio. He said he loved me, but he had to go. I brought my baby a radio. He played it all day. I go, go, I go, go. He liked to dance to it down in the streets. He said he loved me, but he loved the blues.
Don't you know, they're talking about a revolution. It sounds like a whisper. Don't you know, they're talking about a revolution. It sounds like a whisper. While they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know, talking about a revolution. It sounds who are people gonna rise up, get their share? Who are people gonna rise up and take what's theirs? Don't you know you better run, 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 run. Oh, I said you better run, 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 run. 'Cause finally the tables are starting to turn, talking about a revolution. 'Cause finally the tables are starting to turn, talking about a revolution. Oh no, talking about a revolution. Oh, while they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know, talking about a revolution sounds. And finally the tables are starting to turn, talking about a revolution. It's finally the tables are starting nothing but a revolution.
Boys and girls, London calling. Now don't look to us. Phony Beatlemania has bitten the dust. London calling. See, we ain't got no swing except for the ring of the truncheon thing. The ice age is coming. The sun's zooming in. Meltdown expected. The wheat is good in. Engines stop running, but I have no fear, 'cause London is drowning. I live by the river, to the imitation zone. Forget it, brother, you can go it alone. London calling to the zombies of death. Quit holding out and draw another breath. London calling, and I don't want to shout, but while we were talking, I saw you nodding out. London calling, see, we ain't got no hide, except for that one with the yellowy eyes. The ice age is coming, the sun's zooming in. Engines stop running, the wheat is going big. A nuclear error, but I have no fear, 'cause London is drowning. I live by the river. Engines stop running, the wheat is going big. A nuclear error, but I have no fear, 'cause London is drowning. I live by the river. Oh, 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 oh. Oh, oh, oh. Now get this. London calling, yes, I was there too, and you know what they said, well, some of it was true. London calling at the top of the dial, and after all this, won't you give me a smile? I never felt so much alike.
So that's The Clash, Joe Strummer from 1979 at the end there. Before that, we had Tracy Chapman talking about a revolution. Then The Selector, which was also 1979. It's all around the same period. It's around about 1980. Funny, isn't it? That same period of the winter of discontent, just the end of the Labour rule in the 1970s and the beginning of Thatcherism in the 1980s. And before that, of course, Bob Marley and Redemption Song. That was 1980. So almost, I mean, like just either side of the Thatcherism, just before and just after, and that themes in those tunes there. Engines stop running. Yeah, right. So that's maybe there's no oil arriving, that sort of thing. Good old Joe, bless him. He knew what was going on, that's for sure. I wonder if he just died a natural death or not. But we'll be talking in the second part about the potential assassination of the Iranian President Rouhani. And so we're not really sure what happened there. But before we do that, I'm joined on the line by Tim Cohen, the author of The Antichrist and a Cup of Tea. Hi, Tim.
Hi.
First of all, can you just say something about your Antichrist and a Cup of Tea book, which you're so well known for, and why it is that you think that the British royal family are actually going to be involved in the end of the world?
So you asked me about the Antichrist and a Cup of Tea. That is the first and actual book in history to give hard evidence on the identity of the Antichrist, biblical hard evidence. And it happens to be your king, King Charles III.
Yeah, but you said, didn't you, that he was never going to become king?
No, I'm surprised he became king. It wasn't necessary for him to fulfill the role. But he actually has more power and more access to wealth and so forth as king. So it doesn't harm the argument. If anything, it helps it, but I didn't feel it was necessary.
What about the current situation after October the 7th? Can you give us your take on what's been going on over in Gaza? Pretty horrific. We're now up around 45,000 civilian casualties amongst the Palestinians, far less amongst the Israelis, who are extremely well equipped and actually massively supported by Britain, the United States, and the countries and blocs like the European Union.
Yeah, I'd like to say a few things. In fact, I'm going to read something that I sent to you by email previously.
Well, I'd rather you just spoke rather than read something out, please,
no,
Tim.
I'm going to do both, because it's important to make these points that you and I and our other hosts can dialogue specifically on these things. But the first thing I'll say is 45,000 is a false figure. Hamas, the provider of those statistics, continually lies. The statistics have been mathematically shown by professors to be false, to be fraudulent.
By which professors? By which professors?
Hang on. People can just look that up online. It's quite easy
to
find.
I'd like to know from you. If you've done the research, you would surely know who these professors are who say that 45,000 people haven't died.
Hang on, Tony. I'll say this. You even had the United Nations putting out the false numbers from Hamas, which is what you've just cited. And Hamas is actually closer to 35,000 rather than 45 right now. But that being said, the UN itself in the past couple of weeks came out and cut the figure in half for women and children whom they were claiming had died in the war. And Hamas does not distinguish between its, terrorist militants and civilians. And in fact, many of the terrorists who've died are teenagers. They're younger than 20, and they're calling those civilian deaths. So the reality is the number of women and children who died in Gaza is actually very small relative to the percentage of the population. And secondly,
do you want to say what you think the percentage of civilians is, Tim? So I don't want you just reading something out. We've got to have a discussion. There's no point in you coming on here if you're just going to read something out without having any questions.
The majority who have died are Hamas terrorists. More than 15,000 of those who've died are Hamas terrorists. And as far as the number of civilians who've died, Israel has done a stellar job to keep that percentage low compared to any NATO nation, including the United States when it was dealing with Iraq, and Saddam Hussein and so forth. Israel has a fantastic track record in reality for minimizing civilian deaths, and civilian deaths cannot be avoided in a wartime situation.
Well, it's not a war, though, Tim, is it? Because it's very one-sided. The Israelis have an air force. They have United States bombs that they're dropping. Actually, those sorts of bombs that are designed... Can you listen for a second, please? We're having a discussion here. It's not just you reading out some statement. The bombs being dropped in Gaza are actually designed to destroy hard military targets. They're being dropped on civilians, and actually the Gazans, so far as I know, don't even have an air force.
It's a good thing they don't. And in fact, Hamas hides among the civilians and builds their facilities beneath civilian buildings, including schools, hospitals, UNRWA facilities. Israel is taking out those things that are underground, and that's the reason for the need for those bombs. They are, in fact, taking out what are equivalent to hardened facilities because many of them are beneath these structures that Israel is striking.
So why is it that the Israeli Defense Forces have flattened all these civilian areas? Or is it just that there are no real civilians in Gaza and that you have just simply got to kill everybody in order to kill the terrorists?
To flee. Israel is not attacking civilians. They've been warned to flee beforehand.
Yeah, and the big problem this week is that they've been warned to flee to Rafah, which is the last place for them to get to in the very south of Gaza, and now that's being attacked too, which is why the International Criminal Court, Tim, Tim, we're going to have a discussion, really. The International Criminal Court this week has issued issuing arrest warrants for Netanyahu.
Yes, and it's a false equivalence.
Over this concept of telling the civilian population to go to Rafah and then attacking Rafah. So what have you got to say to that?
What I have to say is in the last couple of weeks, Israel has evacuated almost 1 million people from Rafah, faster than the West thought possible. That's already occurred. And Israel is already warning the rest to flee. Rafah has fewer than 2 million, quote-unquote, Palestinians in it. More than half of Rafah has already evacuated in the past couple of weeks under Israeli direction to safe spots. So for you to sit there and say that Israel is attacking civilians in Rafah or this kind of thing is an absolute lie. And it's for you to buy the propaganda of the West.
Well, it's not me that's saying that. This is the International Criminal Court, Tim.
The ICC is lying at the behest of South Africa and other nations that are working on behalf of Hamas terrorists, Qatar, etc., the aiders and abettors, in other words, of Hamas.
What about Benjamin Netanyahu himself, who this arrest warrant is for this week? He himself has faced enormous criticism from within Israel, hasn't he? From his own population, particularly about the treatment of the hostages. He's saying we want all the hostages back, but he's not negotiating for the hostages to come back. He's simply carrying on bombing Gaza and therefore slowly killing those hostages.
No, he's not. In fact, Hamas is seeking to kill the hostages anyway. Most of them are probably already dead. Hamas has been intentionally starving the hostages to death, not providing medical care to them, etc., the opposite of Israel's treatment of the so-called Palestinians, because Israel has not only been allowing the international community to bring massive amounts of aid into Gaza, people are not starving in Gaza. You have more people starving to death in the United States from malnutrition right now than you do in Gaza. Or the whole of Gaza.
Well, they did actually say a similar thing. Some people did about the Nazis, that the concentration camps in Nazi Germany people were not starving in there, that they were like holiday camps, Tim. Many people have made this comparison between the wall around Gaza and the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. So how are these people supposed to get out of that area as it's being bombed? How are the people supposed to leave?
They already have, and they are being evacuated to areas that are not being bombed. For you to allege that the whole of Gaza is being bombed is to show stupendous ignorance of what's actually happening there. And in fact, Israel is being very targeted, moving from area to area to take out the underground Hamas tunnels, the underground supply tunnels. There are over 50 of them coming out of Egypt into the Rafah area. That's already known. Out of over 700 tunnels already identified in Rafah alone that Israel is attacking. So Israel is going after the underground Hamas terrorists, those that are hiding in buildings, those who are not fleeing with the civilians, though some are fleeing with the civilians as well. And that is what Israel is targeting. Israel's not targeting civilians. They never have. And in fact, the percentage of civilians dying in Gaza under Israel's bombardment is tiny compared to what has happened under the United States, even the United Kingdom, in past wars.
What about? Just going to let Martin Summers come in here, my co-host here, Irish Republican Labour activist we call him, but Martin is a member of the Labour Party here in the UK. Martin, what do you make of what Tim's analysis there? He's effectively saying that the Israelis and the Israeli Defence Force have done everything they possibly can to minimise any kind of civilian casualties, but actually that the shall we say 40,000, Tim is saying 35,000, the United Nations is saying 45,000 civilian deaths is actually that they're doing the absolute best they can to minimise those casualties.
Tony,
do you want to correct my figures there?
UN information. That's not what the UN is saying. The UN changed its tune in the past couple of weeks and cut their figures in half for women and children, and they're still blowing hot air.
Yeah, well, I think what happens is the first casualty of war is the truth. Anyway, Martin, what do you make of this assertion Tim's making here that the Israeli Defence Forces are doing everything they can to minimise civilian casualties?
Well, let's start off with why we can agree. The British and US way of war in Iraq was just as barbaric. The Israelis, in a sense, are doing nothing that this country hasn't done and that the US hasn't done in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq. The Israelis are part of the Western team. And in a sense, you'd be quite right to say, why single us out when you're just as bad? I totally agree with that. I think I'm
not saying just as bad, Martin. I'm not saying that. I'm saying what Israel is doing is far superior to what the United Kingdom or the United States or other NATO countries, or for that matter, any military in the world has ever done in the history of warfare. The Israel today is doing all kinds of things that the United States, other NATO nations, never even tried to do to protect civilians, ever, in the history of warfare.
So can you just give us an example, Tim?
Oh, sure. Supplying the civilian population in the middle of war. That's a simple one right there.
Right. Okay, well, I mean...
Knowing that the terrorists, the combatants who want to destroy Israel, are right there in the middle of that population.
I mean, it's a bit of a bit cheeky to talk about the terrorists destroying Israel, Tim, isn't it? Because Israel seems to want to destroy the Palestinians too.
Against Israel.
Tim, can you just answer that point? Tim, could you please just answer the point? You're talking about the Palestinians wanting to destroy the state of Israel, but I mean, by the look of things, Israel is trying to wipe Gaza off the map too.
That's false. If that's what Israel was trying to do, they'd be militarily occupying the whole of Gaza, which they're not doing. In fact, they withdrew battalions before they went into Rafah. And they're not trying to take total control of Gaza. They want to ensure that Gaza can't rearm later to again threaten Israel. But they're not planning to have a military occupation of Gaza. Israel's been clear about that, and Israel has already been allowing Gazan civilians to return to the areas from which they were evacuated previously, except where there's combat operations occurring. And in due course, Israel is seeking to have a multinational group of nations, including Muslim nations particularly, come in to basically govern Gaza, while Israel retains military control of the borders to ensure that Gaza cannot rearm against Israel. And meanwhile, Hamas has said they want to have, 1,000 October 7th and then some against Israel. They want to annihilate Israel off the map. And meanwhile, poll after poll shows that 4 out of 5, if not actually 9 out of 10, Gazans support Hamas and what they did to Israel and would vote for Hamas to be in power if it were their choice following this situation with Gaza right now. These are enemies of Israel and they want to annihilate Israel. They are the actual genocidal maniacs, not Israel.
So don't you think it would make sense, Tim, don't you think it would make sense for the United Nations to send a force in? We've now got this week, we've had also Spain, Ireland and Norway adding their names to the list of countries that recognise Palestine as an independent state. So this does rather suggest that the one-state solution is a total failure and that there needs to be 2 separate states there. And to get the Israeli Defence Forces out and to have some sort of UN force in order to make sure that the Palestinians do have their rights as a nation and are kept away from the Israelis.
All right, there are multiple points to be made around this. The first is that historically God promised all that land to Israel, and not just where the so-called Palestinians are today, but most of the surrounding nations around Israel today are part of Israel's biblical promised land. Now, biblically, Israel has been in rebellion against God by not embracing Christ Jesus, Messiah Yeshua, all this time, who's the real God of Israel incarnate, the real Messiah.
But isn't that so? That is a quid pro quo, surely. If God is giving land, hang on. God is giving the Jews the land, but only if they obey His commandments. Surely, Tim, please answer that one. The land is theirs so long as they behave themselves, basically.
That's right. And Israel is going to come to faith at Yeshua's return some years from now, the surviving third of Israel. So between now and when Yeshua returns a few years from now, 2/3 of Israel in Judea, which is where most of modern Israel's population, the Jewish population, resides, 2/3 will die. That means millions of Israelites are about to die. That means that what Hamas has plotted against Israel to do 1,000 October 7th, it's actually going to be closer to 2,000 or more October 7th that happen in the next few years against Israel from all the surrounding enemies of Israel. So Israel's about to suffer some very horrible things. Now, when we talk about a so-called two-state solution, that is antithetical to Scripture. It's antithetical to God's plan for humanity and for Israel. And in fact, what Scripture actually says is going to occur, if people want to look this up, it's Psalm chapter 83. In Psalm 83, verses 1 to 8, and also Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, it talks about the plotting of the nations against Israel, the surrounding adversaries. It identifies those nations in the psalm and their intention to cut Israel off from being a people. In other words, to genocidally wipe Israel out. We are seeing the fulfillment of that right now. That is what's coming to pass currently and in the coming years before Armageddon. And the consequence of all of this, with the world trying to impose a so-called Palestinian state upon Israel, trying to impose division of Jerusalem, and Scripture is clear that Israel is going to be successfully attacked. The whole city of Jerusalem is going to be encircled by Israel's adversaries. Half the city, specifically, is going to be taken captive and forced by war. We can see that in Zechariah chapters 12 to 14. And the end result of that will be that Israel, at the end of what's called the Great Tribulation, the final 3.5 years preceding Yeshua's return in Armageddon, Jesus' return in Armageddon, the end result will be that the Lord turns the surviving third of Israel Christian in one day. The entire surviving third will become Christian in a single day. And the moment, Tony, that happens, the Lord will turn his attention toward the nations, and he will annihilate Israel's adversaries globally.
Well, that may or may not be the case, but
well,
I mean, a lot of what you're quoting there. Just a minute, can you just hang on? Hang on,
Give
Tim.
me 1 minute to finish.
A lot of
my
what you're
point,
quoting there is Old Testament. Surely this isn't
That's
really
right.
a Christian
Give me
analysis, is
1
it?
minute.
This is
Give me
this
1
is an
minute,
Old Testament
Tony.
analysis you're giving. It's not a New Testament analysis.
It makes no difference. It's an Old Testament prophecy. It's not yet fulfilled, and it's about to be fulfilled. And
Okay,
in
so
fact,
can you tell us where you think
much
we
of
are
the
now?
prophecy
I mean, it's one
in the
thing we
New
can
Testament
definitely agree
derives from the
on
Old.
is this concept of, a lot of people talking about Armageddon, the end of the world, this sort of thing. I mean, it certainly looks to many around the world as if Israel is a nuclear-armed doomsday cult of some sort. Whether it's just the fact that this is a particular bunch of people who are in charge in Israel. But where do you think we are in this end of the world scenario?
Listen, Israel's Knesset is filled with religious Jews, besides secular ones. They know these prophecies. They know that the whole promised land is to go to Israel at some point, and they are not trying to wipe out their adversaries. They're merely trying to defend themselves. It's the Messiah himself who, when Israel turns to faith, is going to then fulfill his promises to the nation as a new Christian nation when the time comes.
But don't you think that actually what the Israeli government, the way it is right now with Netanyahu, Benny Gantz and the rest of them, they're actually discrediting the faith more than anything else. What they're doing is they're sending out a message to the world that you must be mad to believe any of this biblical stuff because you're creating wars because of your twisted beliefs in God.
No. If they were trying to actually follow God and obey God, they wouldn't cede any territory in any agreement ever. And they would have, in 1967, Israel, when they had the opportunity, again, 1973, they would have taken a good portion of Egypt, all of Syria, all of Lebanon, all of Jordan. They could have done that, and they didn't. They chose not to. And in fact, they chose peace with their adversaries who still sought their destruction. But let me say this. God's not going to wipe out all of the Muslims surrounding Israel following Armageddon. Many of them who survive Armageddon and the judgments that ensue following it, after Israel becomes a new Christian nation, will themselves become Christians. And those who sought Israel's destruction but have become Christian at that point, whom the Lord has allowed to live, will be Israel's servants in the expanded promised land, the newly given promised land to Israel, until their natural deaths. And the children who are born to those servants of Israel will be like free individuals in the land of Israel, just like native Israelites themselves.
It almost sounds to me like you're talking here about Israel becoming a kind of world capital in the future at some point.
That is going to happen from Jerusalem under Yeshua. He is going to rule the world from Jerusalem per the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments. But this being said, the world is trying to foist a Palestinian baby. Let's call that the baby of the United Nations and the rest of the nations of the world, trying to foist a Palestinian baby in the midst of the Promised Land versus God's baby, which we'll call Israel. So Jerusalem is where God's baby is centered, if you want to put it that way. And the world is now trying to foist a Palestinian baby on Israel. Let's consider for a moment the story of the two women who each had a son in the Old Testament. One lady rolled over on her baby in the night and suffocated it to death, ostensibly, but the baby died. So she stole the other woman's child, claimed that child for herself.
Yeah, this is also in Bertolt Brecht's Caucasian Chalk Circle, isn't it?
Yep, they both came before Solomon. And Solomon, hearing both women claiming that the child was their own, decided to solve the issue by cutting the baby in two and giving half of the baby to each woman. The real mother of the child said, "No, don't kill my son," and was willing to give her son up to the other woman so that the child would not be killed. Solomon then knew who the actual mother was and gave the child to the real mother rather than the lying woman who killed her own child in the midst of the night. This is what we see today with the world trying to foist a malevolent, vicious, violent, quote-unquote, Palestinian baby on Israel in the midst of the land that God deeded to the nation of Israel. And when under the United Nations, under the Antichrist himself and under the United Nations, Israel is successfully attacked and half of Jerusalem taken captive in war, under the Antichrist, he actually will cut the baby into the surviving baby, which is Jerusalem, because Gaza is going to die due to the malevolence of Israel's adversaries.
Well, look,
Israel's
I mean,
not killing.
a lot of what you're saying is you're reading it out, which is a little bit irritating. But anyway,
No,
Tim,
I'm not reading anything.
Tim, can you
This
just
is all off the top of my head.
can you just listen for a second, because I'd like to ask you about Zionism generally. I mean, what you're painting a picture there is of the Zionists actually doing God's work. Some people have said actually that they're more akin to the Nazis, and they had a lot in common with the Nazis. This idea of the master race, it's nothing to do with love. It's actually all about we are far superior to you.
So I'll say three things about that. There are two kinds of Zionists. There are the Edomite Jews, which are people who descend historically from Edomites who converted to Judaism, like Herod Antipas in the New Testament. And then there are the actual Israelite Jews. The Edomite Jews have always sought to rule the world, including from Israel, by taking over the promises that God deeded to the nation of Israel. And I could say a whole lot about Edomites, and will, in upcoming books, in fact. But the Zionists, who are the more malevolent ones, and there are some malevolent Zionists, are actually the Edomite Jews. And I'm talking about people like the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, people who actually do not believe.
Yeah, but the Rockefellers, hang on, the Rockefellers are Baptists. The Rockefellers are Baptists, not
all
Jews.
No, some are Jews. At any rate, the point I'm getting at is that there are malevolent and non-malevolent people out there. And you actually have some rabbis in Israel today, a small number, who think that the world should be worshiping Israel. You know, who have this attitude, well, you worship, speaking to Christians, for example, you worship one Jew, you should actually be worshiping all of us, because we die for your sins, the nation's sins, in other words, every day. Those are false, satanic viewpoints, just as anti-Christianism is satanic, under the devil. But this being said, it doesn't change the fact that God has made certain promises to the nation of Israel when Israel is faithful to him. It doesn't change the fact that the whole promised land, which Israel in all its history has never had, which is bounded by the Euphrates River, the seas, and that's it.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying here is very much, the ideas from the Old Testament and from the book of Samuel, from the book of Kings. The idea that this is actually the way the world works today. Many people around the world, rightly or wrongly, I would say rightly, will be questioning that. But this connection between Zionists and Nazis cannot just be sort of brushed off. And
yes,
I was noticed recently that someone put out an interesting series of quotes where Nazis were writing about Zionism. So let's have a listen to that now.
Did you know that the Nazis were enthusiastic Zionists and were deeply dedicated to creating a Jewish state in Palestine? Reinhard Heydrich said, The time cannot be far distant when Palestine will again be able to accept its sons, who have been lost to it for over 1,000 years. Our good wishes, together with our official goodwill, go with them. Adolf Eichmann declared, "I am a Zionist too. I want every Jew to leave for Palestine." Dr. Hans Frank proclaimed, "I think that the tragedy of the Jewish people, if we wish to speak of it, could be solved legally by tackling the question of the establishment of the Jewish empire in Palestine with all our might." Alfred Rosenberg insisted, "Zionism must be actively supported in order to transport a certain number of German Jews to Palestine, or generally across the border, every year." Julius Streicher affirmed, "I believe that another international solution would still be found, and that someday discussions would take place between the various states with regard to the demands made by Zionism. These demands aimed at a Jewish state." The Nazi Zionist Song of the National Socialists was a rallying cry to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine for the Jews. Toss out the whole gang of Jews. Toss them out of our fatherland. Send them back to Jerusalem, then they will be among themselves again with their tribe Shem. Toss out the entire Jewish bunch. Toss them out with their crooked noses. The Zionist objective of the Nazi-era board game, Juden raus, Jews get out, is to round up Jews in sixes and send them off to Palestine. The Nazis fulfilled Zionist Theodor Herzl's scheme to transfer Jews under duress from Europe to Palestine in what was called the Transfer Agreement. Well over 60,000 German Jews were coerced into moving to Palestine. They built the new nation of Israel, all according to Herzl's plan.
So I'll put a link up to that. In fact, I'll post that video up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk later. And actually, the references to those quotes, whereabouts they were, the books obviously are not in there. So, but they are actually up on the video. So I'll post that up on our show page later at thisweek.org.uk. What do you got to say to that, Tim?
Yeah, those are mostly lies, those quotes. And in fact, the Nazis, even before World War II, were working with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, called the so-called Grand Mufti, but he was virulently anti-Israel and wanted to annihilate the Israelites, and in fact was stirring up a lot of that hatred that we see today in the surrounding Muslim nations, and particularly among those who became the so-called Palestinians. And in fact, Yasser Arafat was related to this al-Husseini character, but he was basically an Arab Nazi, and his intention was to annihilate all the Israelites and Jews in the Middle East. And Hitler was working with him, and in fact, you had plenty of Arabs who joined the Nazis in World War II because they knew the Nazis wanted to wipe Israel out, and they wanted to support the Nazis.
Well, also,
so
they didn't trust the British, did they? They were fighting the British.
What you just played was a whole lot of nonsense and lies.
Well, okay, so people can check that up when I put. People can check the quotes
it's
up.
The complete opposite of the truth.
Okay, so people can check the quotes later when I pop that up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. But I think it's only fair to let Martin come in and say what he makes of this whole idea of the end of the world, that things are getting crazy, Armageddon, and actually the religious aspect, because for many people, they see the religious people, rather than actually trying to spread love as Christ, Moses, the rest of them wanted to do, to spread the Ten Commandments in order to basically have laws and order in society, as well as, of course, Muhammad. They see these religious people, Martin, as maniacs who are actually going to start a world war if they're not careful.
Well, it's difficult to have a dialogue when we've got so little in common in our way of looking at the world. I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying, Tim, and we just don't see the world in the same kind of way.
I see it correctly, Martin.
Okay, well, obviously you believe that.
Tim, just let Martin finish, please.
Obviously you do believe that. You seem a genuine person to me. You genuinely believe
Martin,
this stuff.
can you just tell me what you make of this religious aspect, which should be for good, but it seems to be turning the other way? Well, I mean,
the traditional Enlightenment view would be that religious ideas are basically infantile, and as we grow, I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm just saying this would be the traditional secularist view. of religious ideas in general, that they are, you know, part of humanity's childhood, and that as we grow up and become more sophisticated, people won't believe these kind of things anymore. I don't think that's actually true. I think people haven't changed that much, and that, you know, people are going to believe what they want to believe. And that includes you and me. You know, I mean, we all believe we're right. Otherwise, we wouldn't believe what we believed, would we? I've got a bit of what you might call a more secular, political, military aspect to all of this. Is that I cannot see how Israel can win from the position they've now got themselves into. The state was created by the British at the end of 1917.
Tim, let Martin have his say.
I'll be brief. The state was created by the British with the Balfour Declaration. That they created the possibility of that state, and then the War of Independence in 1948, in which lots of British soldiers and police officers were killed by Zionist terrorists. They killed our police officers and soldiers. We fought them already. We've been to war with Israel in this country. They were our enemies. And that's how it was. They killed lots of our people, and lots of people in this country were quite angry about it, because it was the British who actually, you know, I'm just saying that there's going to be different views.
Tim, you're going to have to just be quiet, please, and listen to what Martin has to say.
I'll be very brief. I think politically and militarily, this has been a disaster for Israel. Don't forget, you've got the Russian military in Syria, and the war in Syria was fomented by the Western powers to try and overthrow Assad. The Egyptians, who are under a pro-Western military dictatorship, are lining up with Turkey and South Africa on this international criminal, the ICJ condemnation of genocide. Don't forget, the Egyptians have got the biggest army in the Middle East, and if they go to war with Israel, Israel's about the size of Wales.
I've just heard this week as well that the Turks have brought in new laws that the Turkish government, Tim, is now starting to pass laws to make sure that its mobilisation of its citizenry into the Turkish army will go smoothly. So they're preparing to mobilise Turkey for war.
Listen, it's not about the size of militaries. It's not about the capacity of militaries.
And this is all really down to Netanyahu and his friends.
It is entirely about God's will and his timing for things. You know, in 1967, Israel should have been annihilated. 1948, Israel should have been annihilated. 1973, Israel should have been annihilated. But in what is coming, God is going to allow half of Jerusalem to be taken captive in war by force. He's going to allow the annihilation of about 2/3 of Israel in Judea. And at the end of that, when Israel comes to faith and is again faithful to God for the first time in thousands of years, and I'm speaking of the nation as a whole. I'm an Israelite believer right now, so there are hundreds of thousands of us in the world who've already become Christians like me. I'm an Israelite, I'm a Levite, I'm a descendant of Aharon, Moses' brother, directly. I know my tribe, and I'm a Christian at the same time. All of Israel is going to become like me, the surviving third. And when that happens, God will then fulfill his promises to the nation that have not been fulfilled yet historically. Now, that being said, it is true that in the natural, Israel has no hope against this kind of military armada that's being formed against it.
Well, I think surely it's the Palestinians that have no hope against the Israeli Defense Forces.
Can I also make...
Well, I'm not speaking directly of them at the moment, but to address them just briefly, I said the Palestinian baby is going to die, and I meant it. In other words, they've killed themselves. They've had multiple opportunities to have that second state with Israel. Under Barak, under Ehud Olmert, etc. There were plenty of, I'll call them traitors in Israel who don't believe in God or his promises, who were willing to negotiate away the land and give the so-called Palestinians almost everything they wanted.
Well, yeah, Rabin was assassinated for his trouble, wasn't he?
Half of Jerusalem.
What have you got to say about that? Rabin was assassinated. He tried to do this.
Arafat and Abu Mazen turned them down. They rejected those offers, and now we are where we are.
So was it good to have Rabin assassinated, do you think, Tim?
He was assassinated, of course.
Was it good? Was that God's will?
Well, it happened, so yes, it was God's will.
And it's God's will that Hamas are basically standing the Israeli Defense Occupation Forces a serious fight. It's a big, very serious fight on the measure of the Warsaw Ghetto. And as you say, that a third of the Israelites are going to be destroyed, then Hamas are carrying out God's will, aren't they?
They are.
They are.
And
so they're on God's side. That's what they think.
Anyway, we don't have a tremendous amount of time, but what we're going to hear from now is a woman called Melanie Ward. She's the chief executive of something called Medical Aid for Palestinians, and they have been doing quite a lot of work in trying to get aid in, which has been extremely difficult for them to do. So Melanie Ward is the Chief Executive Officer of Medical Aid for Palestinians, and she's been talking this week about their efforts to get aid through the blockade into the people in Gaza.
We reported earlier about that new pier into the sea, which was going to be used to try and get more aid into people who are still trying to carve out a living in Gaza. Melanie Ward is the Chief Executive Officer of Medical Aid for Palestinians, one of the organisations working in this zone. Melania, welcome to our coverage. What updates do you have? Is enough aid getting through? Is any aid getting through just now?
Tiny amounts of aid have been getting into Gaza only for the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago today, the Israeli military took control of the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing, and that was the main place for aid to cross into Gaza. But it's important, obviously, we're in an absolutely desperate situation where for almost 8 months now, people in Gaza, civilians in Gaza, have been denied access to the most basic of supplies. The lack of food, the use of starvation as a weapon of war is the reason why we have famine conditions in large parts of Gaza. And ever since the Israelis took control of the Rafah crossing, no aid has been able to get in through that route. So ourselves as Medical Aid for Palestinians, we have 17 trucks of aid. That's medical supplies, shelter items like tents and so on, which are waiting to cross and which are unable to do so. It's also not just aid. The closure of the crossings means that medical evacuations of seriously injured children are unable to take place. And it means that aid workers like myself and the doctors who work with my organisation are unable to come into Gaza to support in the hospitals there. So the situation is absolutely desperate, and people are dying because of what's being done here.
And the stumbling block, I mean, there's probably several stumbling blocks, to be honest, is what? Is it Israeli officialdom at the border post?
It's very clear to the world that there have been deliberate efforts to stop adequate amounts of aid being allowed into Gaza. And that's been done through border crossing points. Land crossings have been closed. Or in the case of one of the other crossings that exists just now, there is heavy bombing and shelling on the other side of it. So even if the border crossing was open and we were able to get some trucks in, nobody can go there to collect it because there are Israeli airstrikes and shelling from tanks all around it. So there's a deliberate, closure and restriction of aid that's getting in through the land crossings. That's the main problem. We also have trouble though with trying to move items around inside of Gaza. Obviously, if you're going to move around trucks and trucks of medical supplies, food, water, other such items, you need fuel. Yeah. So fuel is not being allowed in an adequate amount either. And then across Gaza has been divided into two between the north and the south. And there are Israeli checkpoints right across there. And so even aid workers trying to move from the south of Gaza to the north, where the famine is worst, there are many instances of aid workers, including UN workers, being shot at when they try to cross that. So the whole thing comes together to make this the most difficult and dangerous place in the world to try to deliver aid. And with great fanfare, of course, the United States have put in place their new maritime corridor. That's what they call the floating pier. Yes. But only actually a tiny trickle of aid is able to get in.
Is that even working? Do you understand is that even working? Is anything coming by that route?
My understanding is that there have been a small number of trucks that have come in from that route, but they come from Cyprus. And it's a very convoluted way to try to get aid supplies in, when in fact, as I say, there are many land crossings between Israel and Gaza. And if the Israelis would just open the land crossings to aid, we could literally drive it in from a few miles away rather than having to bring it across the sea. And the other problem with the US floating pier is that it will not operate past September because the sea will become too rough then. So these things may provide tiny amounts of change, tiny amounts of supplies in the face of overwhelming, massive humanitarian need, but they're not proper solutions. I was in Gaza myself last month. I saw the situation for myself. It couldn't be more desperate. You have more than 2 million people without adequate access to water, to food, to shelter. People have had to leave their homes and they're sheltering under very flimsy pieces of plastic. There isn't adequate sanitation. People have nowhere to go to the toilet. So on every measure, the humanitarian disaster is absolutely enormous.
And Melody, tell us your experience then of how on earth did you get into the territory to see your colleagues, and how did your journey out? I mean, what route did you take?
So I crossed from Egypt, which is the route that most humanitarians and medical workers have been using for the last 8 months, through the Rafah crossing. And that's the crossing which the Israelis took control of 2 weeks ago, and which we're no longer able to use. So
it's a dangerous route, though, isn't it? Yeah. Did you have a sense of your own personal safety was under threat?
Of course, I'm very aware that Gaza is a very dangerous place to work. But we as Medical Aid for Palestinians have many Palestinian colleagues who live and work in Gaza. So obviously they're the ones who are at most risk. So for me, it was very important to go to see them, to see the situation in the hospitals for myself, where my organisation MAP is working, and to see the conditions on the ground for myself. And I can't express the extent to which the scale of the need is absolutely enormous. There are just displaced people everywhere who've had to flee their homes. There are lakes of raw sewage right next to the tents where they're living and where children are playing. There isn't enough water. I saw children sitting by the roadside with empty pans, empty plates, because they don't have enough to eat and are in famine conditions, as you know. I went to a hospital, Al-Aqsa Hospital in the middle area. One of the things you might be aware of is that only a tiny handful of Gaza's hospitals are still operating. And we had Medical Aid for Palestinians doctors supporting in that hospital. But I've never seen anything like it. The hospital was so overcrowded. I went into a children's ward, which was supposed to, the bay I went to was supposed to have 3 children in it. And instead it had 8. And every one of the children had severe injuries from Israeli airstrikes. I saw a little girl with a severe arm injury and abdominal injuries, and she was screaming in pain because there wasn't enough pain relief to give her. So it's a disaster on every level, and tiny trickles of aid are not the answer. We need full and unimpeded access for aid across all land crossings and for aid workers. And what we need most of all is an immediate and lasting ceasefire.
Melanie Ward, thank you very much indeed for spending a few minutes with us. Melanie's the Chief Executive Officer of Medical Aid for Palestinians.
Yeah, so MAP, we used to have a cup in the previous studio with Medical Aid for Palestinians on the side of it. Tim, I guess you'd say you don't want a ceasefire. You think this is God's will for the war to carry on, or I don't know. What do you think?
All right, well, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, if you're going to play some long thing like that, interrupted enough for me to respond to what's being said. But let's start with this. That was a Palestinian woman claiming to represent an objective viewpoint. Most of what she said were flat-out lies.
No, hang on. Sorry to interrupt you, but she's Tim. She's not Palestinian. She's Scottish. Tim, she's not Palestinian. Tim, she's not Palestinian. She's Tim.
Brothers and sisters.
Tim,
allow me to make my point.
She's not Palestinian. She's Scottish.
Allow me to make my point. What she said was false. There's more than 100 vehicles going in even now per day into Gaza. The firing at people trying to get aid in and so forth is primarily coming from Hamas terrorists themselves, who've already attacked the pier twice at least. Secondly, Israel has tried to reopen the Rafah crossing for aid coming from Egypt. It's the Egyptians themselves who have refused to reopen it. She didn't bother to mention that. Thirdly, there's another crossing, at least one or two others that Israel has already opened into Gaza that are operating right now, every day, normally. So it's completely false, the picture that she portrayed. Additionally, there are, like I said, more people starving here in the United States, percentage-wise, today than in Gaza today. They're not starving there. Yes, they are having problems with shelter and cold and all of that. That's true. But they are not starving there. And there's plenty of food there, in fact, at this point in time for the Palestinians in Gaza. All this being stated, I was trying to get to a point before you played all that about God's will in all of this situation, what Hamas is doing. So here's what I'm going to say. Christ was crucified at the middle of the crucifixion week. It was God's will that he be crucified and then rise from the dead at the end of that week. What Israel is suffering now and about to go through, where 2/3 of Israel in Judea dies, preceding Armageddon, is God's will. And it's because the nation has been unfaithful to him, and he's allowing the devil and his minions to have their way, if you will, with Israel to an extent. But once Israel repents and turns back to God, the surviving third, at that point, the Lord will turn his attention to the nations of the world who've treated Israel so very wickedly and falsely accused Israel like they're doing now at the ICC. You recall that Yeshua, Jesus, was tried before Pilate, and prior to that, before Caiaphas and Ananias, the hypocritical, priests of Israel at the time, and then before the Romans. Pilate represented the Romans. And then he was crucified. He was tried first. What we're seeing right now between the ICC and the ICJ, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, the latter one being more directly connected to the United Nations, is an effort to bring Israel before the world to try the nation. And Netanyahu, if you will, is representative of the nation of Israel. So the world is going to falsely accuse Israel. Netanyahu standing in this case, for Messiah in a very loose manner of speaking, and going to convict Israel and decide to crucify Israel, and that's what taking half of Jerusalem captive
you have actually already made that point. There's a sort of battle for hearts and minds as well going on, which the Israelis have lost. So I put it to you that you're putting the position, which is actually a Gnostic position, Tim. Tim, you do have to listen as well. You've had a good say there. It's actually a Gnostic position where you're actually portraying the Israeli leadership, the Greater Israel bloc, which is now running the country, as fulfilling God's will, where actually they're fulfilling the will of the devil. This is a Gnostic point of view you're putting forward, isn't it?
Fulfilling the will of the devil by doing these things toward Israel, yes, and God is going to allow it. Those who do these things toward Israel are cursed by God. Let me be clear. And all the nations of the world that are involved in doing these things toward Israel are going to be annihilated.
I don't understand why you think that Israel somehow represents God. For many people around the world, Tim, for many people around the world, Israel is right now is representing the devil.
Tony, Israel, while it's not serving God faithfully, those who are trying to pursue God's promises, saying, for example, we should settle the land, God deeded it to Israel, etc., we shouldn't be negotiating away the land, this kind of thing, even though they're not in faith in Yeshua yet, it's those individuals who will come to faith down the road, the ones who survive, and form a newly Christian Israel around the time of Armageddon and following Armageddon. So far as the rest of the world is concerned, those who are pursuing the division of Israel's land, the formation of a so-called Palestinian state, which is satanic, and Islam is a satanic religion. Let me be clear about that. It's always been a satanic religion. It is not a religion of peace. Never has been. It's always been built on murder, rapes, thefts, destructions, and, of course, spiritual lies. That's all it has ever been. But that being said, those who are pursuing the devil's agenda through Islam and other false religions against Israel, and ultimately against Christians, so against Judeo-Christianity, because they'll come for Christians next. Many Christians are going to be martyred in the Great Tribulation. It isn't only Israel that will suffer. But when these things are done, and Israel comes to faith, and God's purposes are accomplished
it doesn't
toward
seem
Israel,
to be going to happen anytime soon.
Then,
Tim, can you just wind up within the next 20 seconds, please, in this particular point, because it's going on a bit too long.
Israel is going to come to faith. Most of the nations of the world are going to cease to exist. The nations that will remain are a smaller Egypt, a newly constituted Assyria, and a vastly enlarged nation of Israel in the Middle East. And all around them will be newly constituted nations that replace the nations that exist today.
Yeah, well, this certainly seems to be the mission of the Israeli Greater Israel bloc. Can you finally just tell listeners whereabouts they can find you online and how to get hold of your various books?
Yes, prophecyhouse.com, and they'll find all these things and many more, including the actual identity of the Antichrist in my books. And the latter one is The Antichrist in a Cup of Tea. The new second edition has just begun to ship, so it's out. Gives hard evidence that King Charles III is the Antichrist of biblical prophecy.
Well, fascinating stuff anyway. Thank you ever so much for your time. Let's just make it clear that there is this Gnostic point of view which puts the devil in place of God when interpreting the monotheistic faiths. And Tim Cohen, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Tony.
So we'll wind up, I think, tonight, Martin, by looking at the death of the Iranian president, Raisi. What are your initial thoughts about that?
Well, obviously, I've been looking into it, like everybody, to try and work out what's happened here. Most of the stuff I've been reading is just we shouldn't be jumping to conclusions until the Iranians themselves have decided what's happened, because they're the ones who are investigating it. But of course, the possibility Martin, of him being assassinated is definitely there.
It annoys me when you say that, because this is what we always do on this show. We do quite a lot of intelligent guesswork, as well as based on information which is phrased. So, for example, in Iran, they've been very, very careful not to say anything about this because they will be doing their own internal investigation. That doesn't mean to say, for example, the Times of India and the Pakistani press haven't got contacts inside Iran who have been leaking information about evidence in one way or the other on this.
Well, all I'll say is that the stuff I've been reading is from people who are saying let's not jump to conclusions. I'm thinking like Larry Johnson, the ex-CIA guy, Marchanov, who used to be in the Russian Navy, Moon of Alabama, which is Bernard, who's a German ex-military person. It's quite possible that it'd be perfectly rational for the Iranians to think that this was an Israeli hit, because the Israelis have been carrying out hits inside Iran for years and years and years. Nobody doubts that Soleimani was killed by Trump on the behest of the Israelis.
We've had I think it was not long into the 1980s when the entire Iranian government was blown up with a bomb. The entire government. That's it was like, I think something like 2/3 of the cabinet was killed, for example. So this has been going on.
Yes, in other words, it's perfectly reasonable for people to suspect that. But
the circumstances were, let's just get it clear, there was a dam inauguration in Azerbaijan on the border with Iran, and the president was flying back to Tehran or somewhere else anyway, another city, with his entourage, and the foreign minister was in his helicopter. There were two other helicopters all flying basically line abreast, so with the president's helicopter in the middle. A lot of people have been talking about the weather. Actually, the weather is down below. The helicopters have got a ceiling. The Bell 212 is about 17,000 feet. So what they tend to do in that sort of situation is fly maybe 500 feet above the cloud ceiling. So they'll be flying so they can see each other. But they'll be above the cloud, as the cloud is like a blanket below them. And what the reports so far have been saying is that the president's helicopter in between, suddenly the pilots on the outside noticed it had gone. Where has it gone? There was no radio call or anything, apparently. And so they made a distress call saying, we've lost the president. And of course, you can't go down really in a helicopter to try and find out what's happened to your other helicopter into the cloud. So the fact that there was no distress call, for me, Martin, means it's unlikely to have been some kind of pilot error, because you've got a pilot and a co-pilot. The co-pilot might say, oh, something's happened to the pilot. He doesn't seem to be very well or whatever. And it also is unlikely to be mechanical failure, because helicopters are pretty robust things. If you even get an engine failure, something as drastic as that, helicopters don't just fall out of the sky. They do something which is called auto-rotate. So as the helicopter goes down, the blades will, obviously they'll have a bit of momentum from when the engine was going, but the blades can then be made to just rotate, so it can come down fairly slowly. What is difficult to know is how high they are above the ground. So the fact that they didn't make a distress call is actually quite an important part of the investigation into whether this was an accident or whether it was somehow sabotaged.
Well, let me make this point. Azerbaijan and Iran are actually, although they're both Shia Muslims and they speak the same language, there's a great deal of hostility between the regime in Azerbaijan and the regime in Tehran.
I mean, is it possible a device might have been planted on the helicopter?
I'm just coming to this. Now, the reason for this hostility is because a large proportion of people in the north of Iran regard themselves as Azeri, but they're actually inside the border of Iran. And that's why there's tension between the two regimes, because even though they've got shared religious history and they even speak the same language, there's actually tension about where that border should go. Now, the president going to inaugurate a dam with the Aliyev, who's the president of Azerbaijan, was an obvious possibility that somebody could infiltrate that and put in a bomb, because the Azeris are very, very aligned with the Western powers and the Israelis. Okay? So the possibility, there's definitely means, motive and opportunity here. And in any case, leaving aside whether or not he was assassinated on this occasion, the absolute hostility of the Zionist regime and the West towards the Iranians is well known.
They're actually talking about wanting. It's in my hospital. They actually want a war.
That's right. And of course, plenty of people in the US of Tim's persuasion have been cheering this. Even though it might have been an accident, they're saying it's good. Thank goodness he's dead.
It's not just people in the USA, Martin. It's including the Western TV networks.
Yes, that's right. Yes,
have been saying. There's actually loads of people in Iran who will be celebrating.
Well, strangely,
actually, there was a massive funeral with something like 1.5 million people.
That's right. Out. Well, I mean, obviously they've got their own. The problem for people who assassinated
more than for Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, well, Soleimani was assassinated, and he was probably because he was military, but he had the possibility of being the next president because that often happens that top military leaders can become politicians.
But,
like Eisenhower.
Jeremy Bowen, I remember listening on Wednesday to him or was it Monday actually. The same day, by the way, as the International Criminal Court announced the arrest warrants was on Monday. So we had a very interesting week, didn't we? This helicopter disappeared on Sunday. Monday, we had the announcement of Raisi's death, and we also had the International Criminal Court announcing arrest warrants for the Israeli leadership, as well as some of the Hamas people. Then on Wednesday, general elections announced. So, I mean, I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that there is a connection here, that the problems in the Middle East and the ructions of maybe or maybe not supporting what the Israelis are up to over there have triggered this election. But the point is, but Jerry Bowen's point was, I cannot think of a reason why a motive behind this being an assassination of Raisi.
Well, that's absurd. I mean, frankly, of course, there's a possibility that he was assassinated.
He can't see a motive. He said, I find it difficult to think of a motive.
Well, that's just pathetic. There's obviously a motive, and in actual fact, you can almost imagine that the Israelis may boast about having done it. That's the sort of thing they do.
Well, there is this other thing. It's just a sort of dog whistle thing in these situations, isn't it? So the Israelis will be secretly, well, not even secretly, they'll be thinking, oh, God's on our side. Look, oh dear, his helicopter's fallen. Actually, this is partly the intelligence services playing God, maybe.
Well, what may happen, and what I understand will happen, is that the vice president takes over, and there will be an election within 50 days.
Is there going to be much change politically, do you think?
No, what may happen is that Pepe Escobar was going about how Raisi was quite a significant figure because he was in the middle between what you might call the pro-Western factions in the political elite in Iran and the anti-Western factions. So he was a sort of balancing figure between those two factions. But he definitely came down more because obviously people like, what's his name, Rafsanjani, they've been discredited. Because why don't we just try and be nice to the Americans and then they'll be nice to us? It just doesn't work. There's no point trying to be nice because the Americans don't take any notice.
Looking at all this on Sunday evening, Martin, the only source saying that they thought they knew what had happened was an American source saying, oh yes, it looks like the helicopter was brought down deliberately. This is an American source, but there was no official announcement about really much at all until the Monday. Ultimately, the fact is, as well, it's going to have a very negative effect on the morale of the Iranians, isn't it, in this big struggle, to have their president suddenly disappeared in a mysterious, rather dark fashion, and no one's supposed to know what happened. I'm sure most people, both in Israel, in Iran, and around the world, have got their own ideas about what happened there.
Well, I think what I've been reading suggests that when the election is held, what will happen is that the more hardline faction will win. Okay?
So war is more likely.
Yes, war is more likely, and of course the Israelis think they want a war with Iran, but what happened the other week when the Iranians actually fired their missiles towards Israel was that they were given the checkmate. We can fire missiles at you, but you can't fire missiles back at us, which is the same as true of the Russians in their relation to NATO. So Tim Cohen there may have some biblical insight, he imagines he has, but in actual fact, from a military point of view, both NATO and Israel are toast, because they haven't got hypersonic missiles and they haven't got the drone production that the alternative world government coming from China, Russia and Iran have now got.
So we heard Medvedev last week talking about citizens of the European nations and the United States wanting their citizens to be turned into grey radioactive dust.
Yes, well, I mean, I don't think that's terribly helpful from Medvedev, because, of course, the Russians will also be turned into grey radioactive dust if it comes to that. But what we have got is that, from a military point of view, the Ukrainian army is going to collapse. The Israeli army will not be able to control northern Israel or the south of Israel because they can't go into Lebanon to take out Hezbollah, so they can't take the people back into northern Israel from all the kibbutzim up in northern Israel. They have been pushed out of that territory. They can't go back. There's no way back for them. And of course, if Hezbollah are drawn into the battle, they will then immediately attack all of the military infrastructure inside Israel. They're already picking off individual things. There's nothing the Israelis can do about that. They can kill civilians in Lebanon, but that won't change the military balance.
So the World Court today has ordered Israel to halt a Rafah military operation. This is the International Court of Justice. Do you think they will?
Well, don't forget this.
And what if they don't?
Well, what's happened also is that the Egyptians, who have been allied with Israel since the 1970s, have now said that they are going to support the ICJ court case by the South Africans. Now, the Egyptian government is in fact a military government supported by the West. If there was a democratic government in Egypt, they'd already have gone to war with Israel. Now, the Israelis are pretty good at killing civilians, but it seems that their part-time army, which is effectively what it is not good enough to take on the big boys. And the big boys are the Russian aerospace forces in Syria. If the Russians decide to eliminate the Israeli air defences, they will do it. And they can do it from Siberia. They don't have to do it from Syria. And if NATO tries to step in to help the Israelis, they can sink all of the ships in the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing, that the West can do about any of that.
Okay, well, what about China? Because this week there's been exercises about the Chinese potentially kicking the Americans out. And so anyway, let's hear this is a very serious little thing going on as a side issue, which could ignite a much wider war if this thing in the Middle East gets... So let's have a listen to this Al Jazeera report about that now. Taiwan's One China policy. What is China's latest military drills around Taiwan? What do they mean for the region?
In Beijing, Victor Gao is vice president of the Center for China and Globalization, a leading Chinese think tank.
No, I think Lai Ching-te's speech on May the 20th, as far as the One China policy is concerned, is tantamount to a declaration of war. He risks the peace between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. And China need to do something to teach him a lesson and to warn the separatists in Taiwan that don't go beyond the point of no return, because otherwise China, as demonstrated by this round of the joint military exercises, will decide to blockade Taiwan. And that will really crumble the economy in Taiwan, and it will really force Lai Ching-te to the corner, because if he tries to resurrect the unfinished civil war between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait in 1949, for example, that's what he will get. And if he wants to bring disaster to the people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait by risking the so-called Taiwanese independence or separatism, that's what he will get. And this is not against the people in Taiwan. This is very focused on the separatists in Taiwan. Now, in the world of today, no one can recognize both China and Taiwan at the same time, because that's in violation of the One China policy. any attempt to push Taiwan into a separate, sovereign, independent country is dead before it's starting. And that's the lesson that China need to teach Lai Ching-te. And if he really wants to become more and more desperate to push for the so-called independence of Taiwan, he will destroy peace across two sides of the Taiwan Strait, and he will bring calamities not only to the people in Taiwan, but many other stakeholders in this part of the world. We are at a critical moment. We need to promote peace rather than allow people like Lai Ching-te to destroy peace.
So that's one of the chief Chinese representatives there speaking about that whole situation. Martin, you see, effectively saying, look, if you push it any further, we're just going to blockade Taiwan.
Well, that's obviously the military strategy that they will pursue, because Taiwan can be completely surrounded. You know, nothing goes in, nothing comes out. Their economy collapses. You don't actually have to do an amphibious landing. But of course, at that point, the Americans might then come in to try and break the blockade, and then you have a fight.
Yes, you have a war. You have a world war.
You have a world war. Can I just make a point?
Yeah.
Although there's been a presidential election in Taiwan, and the pro-separatist forces won that presidential election, in Taiwan, unlike in France, for example, it's a first past the post election to the presidency. So if you add up the votes of the two losing candidates, who are basically more pro-Chinese, the Kuomintang candidates are split. So their camp is a bit split.
Well, that's a good way to fix the election, isn't it?
It's just a good way to fix the election. That's why first past the post is such a rubbish way to run things. But the point is that there was an election to the parliament at the same time, and it was quite clear that this current separatist president doesn't have a majority in the Taiwanese parliament, that the majority are still in favour of the existing policy, which is not to seek full independence. Now, I think that should calm thoughts on the Chinese side, because they can read these tea leaves like anybody else. It's a fluke that this guy's been elected. If there'd just been two candidates, he wouldn't have been elected, and we would have carried. And don't forget, very interestingly, former presidents of Taiwan from the Kuomintang Party, the Nationalist Party, have been visiting China and meeting with senior officials to try and calm things down. So when that guy says, well, it's not against the Taiwanese people, the Taiwanese people in the majority do not want to push for independence.
What? I bet it's the United States that is
the United States wants to cause the trouble.
Yeah.
They're the ones who are pushing this.
And the fact there is a wonderful film by the good old John Pilger, The Coming War with China, which does a fantastic job in detailing the successful attempts of the United States over the last 30 or 40 years to put military bases all around China. And in fact, nearly to nuke China during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's a brilliant section.
Taiwan was under Japanese occupation before World War II, and it's actually from Taiwan that Japan invaded China. So you can see why they take this seriously.
Anyway, also this week we're saying goodbye to one of our great friends.
Just think of the power of the combination of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and big data. So it's a combination of the different technologies which really bring the fundamental change. And finally, I think we have to be prepared for a world where we see a fusion of our physical, our digital, and our biological dimensions. So it will be a world integrating the physical, biological, and the digital dimensions. So it will be a new world. And I'm looking for a minister in 10 years. Probably it will be completely different from what it is now.
That's Klaus Schwab. 53 years he's been running the World Economic Forum. Martin, he's now stepping down.
Well, Klaus Schwab is himself a factotum. I mean, people focusing on him as if he ran the World Economic Forum.
Well, what does worry me is they've got some sort of really very, very peculiar ghoul waiting in the sidelines to take over.
Well, of course. I mean, he steps down and somebody else will step up, but the real masters of the universe aren't people like him that you can even talk to.
Yeah, so there'll just be more slick PR people. I mean, it's just one of the things, when I look at him, I think, this guy can't really sell anything. He's a bit like somebody like Yeltsin in 1990s Russia. You know, most of the people have got absolutely no interest or faith in him whatsoever. And the similar thing with Schwab. So maybe somebody a little bit slick might do a better job.
Well, I think the World Economic...
in selling the lies.
Well, the pressures behind this are, you know, the powerful forces that run the Western deep states. And the World Economic Forum is just one forum which they meet in. They meet at Bilderberg. No doubt they have lots of private chats as well. You know, that's what we're up against. But what's changed is that we've now got Russia and China in a strong enough position to stand up to them. The Russian economy is booming. Our economy isn't booming. That's why Putin was re-elected with 88% of the vote. And
So does that make a kind of world war kind of inevitable? And the fact that we've completely failed to take these countries on economically? In fact, it almost seems deliberate that that's happened.
Well, there's, in America, you may have come across this, there's a famous book that's been written recently called The Thucydides or Thucydides Trap, which is and it's all about the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, and eventually the Spartans had to go to war with the Athenians because they were becoming too powerful. Somebody had to stop them. And they're saying that this is the same sort of problem that the United States was going to have. It's going to have to go to war with China and Russia because we've got to stop them, otherwise we're going to lose our preeminent position. Now, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's no reason why the West couldn't cooperate with the Russians and the Chinese to manage shared problems. But we've got the idea that there's an element of, you know, we've always run the world and we can't live in a world where we're not in charge. But the fact is that short of nuclear war, they're going to lose because ultimately war is decided on who's got the best economic policy. And the Russians have basically got a nationalised arms industry, and the Chinese have got a nationalised banking industry.
I think
that is simply superior.
War with
you can't
Russia,
beat it.
War with Russia will make, you know, with Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair running it, will make Iraq look rather like a Sunday school picnic, won't it? I mean, NATO's state PM, Prime Ministers, has been calling this week for the breakup of Russia. It's not a bad thing when a big power becomes much smaller. Estonia's Kaja Kallas has said the conflict between Moscow and Kiev should end with the defeat and breakup of the Russian Federation. Estonia's Prime Minister Kaja Kallas says this week.
Well, I mean, she's saying the quiet bit out loud, which is why the Russians aren't having any of it. Can I say that in Estonia, the port of Narva, which is in eastern Estonia, is virtually 90% Russian. So they could just vote to leave Estonia. If we're going to talk about breaking countries up, Narva has been Russian since Peter the Great conquered it in the 16th century.
It's just another one of those sort of territorial conflicts that has been left festering deliberately.
Right. Well, it's not been left festering deliberately. They're just there because wherever you draw the line in the sand, in Israel or Estonia or anywhere else, there's always somebody on the wrong side of it.
I touched on this earlier on, but I did get it wrong. It's not the Slovakian government official. It's a Georgian government official. Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze has claimed that the European Commissioner has told him he could end up suffering the same fate as Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, who survived an assassination attempt last week. In a Facebook post on Thursday, Kobakhidze said the unnamed commissioner, warned him during a recent phone call that the West would take a number of measures against him if his government pressed ahead with a law requiring foreign NGOs in Georgia to disclose their funding. While listing these measures, he mentioned, "You see what happened to Fico, and you should be very careful."
Well, I mean, that again is the quiet bit saying out loud. But the Georgian ruling party actually have a solid majority in the parliament, 2/3 plus. So the presidential veto by the president, who was actually born in France and never lived in Georgia before they became the president, and doesn't actually speak Georgian very well.
So is Georgia with the West or with Russia?
Well, they're a swing state that could have gone either way, but because I think they've wised up that they're being used as a means of.
They don't want to become another Ukraine.
Well, they don't. Absolutely don't. And the current elected government, and they have a 2/3 majority in the parliament, are definitely trying to pull away from the orbit of the West. Now, that is dangerous for them to do that, but it's even more dangerous for them to be used as a battering ram against Russia, which has been their neighbour for centuries. You know, you can't defeat geography. The United States is thousands and thousands of miles away, and so is Britain. At the end of the day, Russia is Georgian economy is integrated with the Russian economy. Of course it is.
So
where else do they sell
just to
their
round
stuff?
all this up, you really don't think that whether it's the King or someone else has pressed the button saying, actually, we now want a war government in, and that bringing back Blair, Mandelson, Alistair Campbell, people like this behind the scenes, with Starmer fronting it, is not the reason why the general election's been called this week?
I think that's over-egging it, Tony. General elections in Britain are actually quite parochial. We think they're important, but the great big world out there, not so much. There is going to be a war, and of course they want the Labour establishment are very much in favour of it. There's been loads of wobbles about Gaza, but there hasn't been any wobbles at all, as far as I can see, about the Ukraine. Everybody thinks that Putin is Hitler, however absurd that may sound.
It's totally ridiculous. Of course, there'll be many, many voices in Parliament and in the military saying this is absolutely insane to try and take the Russians on. This will be suicide. Let's not do it.
Well, what's interesting to me is I listen to military voices in Britain. People like General Michael Rose would no doubt say exactly that. But I'm afraid Sir Patrick Sanders, who runs the British Army, is under the delusion that we are going to war with Russia. We've just got to buckle up and get ready for it, and we're going to win, which is absolutely insane. The Russians this week said, if you fire those Storm Shadow missiles towards our bases, we're going to fire back, and we're going to be firing at Portsmouth, Catterick, and Salisbury Plain. We'll wait until you've got plenty of troops bunched up, and then we'll hit you, and you will lose maybe 1,000 people in one of those hits, unless you get down in your bunkers.
A bit of food for thought then for voters.
Well, it might happen just before the election. If I was the Russian General Staff, I'd wait for the week before the election.
Yeah, Dave Bazanko, sound engineer, pointed out 4th of July is quite a significant date, isn't it? This is America saying, we want you to have an election, please.
Well, I think it's just... I think that's carrying things too far, Tony.
No, it's not. This is the sort of in-joke they love.
No, well, maybe, Tony, but I don't think it serves any useful purpose. But I can certainly see how the Russian General Staff would say, if they fire missiles at us, we won't fire back until the week before the election. Then we'll kill hundreds, possibly thousands of British service personnel, and then there's nothing that Britain can do about it. They can't fire back because all the missiles will be shot down. They could go to nuclear war, but then the Russians will annihilate Britain. And one of the things I might do if I was the Russian General Staff is just pick on the British. Don't do it to the Americans. So that puts the Americans in a bind. Do we have our military bases attacked? Because the Russians have got the capability to attack military bases inside the United States of America.
You know what, it sounds to me like...
they can attack a military base in Nevada from Siberia. It takes about half an hour.
2024 sounds to me like the summer of hate. Let's hope none of this, and pray that none of this transpires, and that sensible people... are in charge. Anyway, finally this week, Walter Veith, we heard a little bit from him last week, and a fascinating talk that he did about how Islam replaced Christian areas by force. This is his talk about did the Vatican create Islam?
Now, early Islam, which area did it occupy? This area. This area. Who ruled over here? Who ruled there? Only Christianity. Before there was Islam, that is where Christianity was. And so Islam took hold of this area. Then by AD 750, Islam progressed and took over all this, including Spain. That's fascinating. Spain and all this Asia Minor area was controlled by Islam. Did you know who ruled in Spain? It was the Visigoths. And the Visigoths had a different gospel to Catholicism. They were more in line with the Ostrogoths, who actually were Sabbath keepers. Problem people that had to get sorted out there maybe for a while. Just speculating. AD 900, there they go, withdrawing from the north of Spain. The Franks were very strong Catholic supporters. Slowly, Islam is moving out. And there, this whole area controlled now by Islam. 1,100 in the south of Spain. In the south, there's a group which is more independent than in the north. Tremendous battle, the Spanish area. And then they control this area. And AD 1,500, they're out of Spain. The West Roman Empire is totally Catholic. This is Catholic. And Rome controls the Catholic world. And Islam controls this area. Today, this is the Islamic distribution, and there are two sects, the Sunni and the Shia, and they control vast areas. A huge area, but initially where Christianity was, today you can put Islam. There's an interesting story that some say that the red fez comes from having dipped the blood into the Christians, having dipped the fez into the Christian blood at Fez. Whether that is true or not, I would not wish to speculate, but it's interesting. Gary H. Carr, remember, speaks of the ancient mystery religion controlled by Freemasonry and the Illuminati and the World Council of Churches. Now, what if the true mystics behind the scene, the power mongers, are really in Rome, and that they control everything, including this other religion, through insiders? And then, if you put all the pieces together with all the references that there are tremendous links between the Templars and the Islamic secret societies, the Ismailis, the Karmatites, the Fatimites, the Druzes, and the Assassins. Now, the Assassins were interesting because they would kill themselves to gain an advantage. They could blow themselves up to destroy others. Do we have something like that today? Oh, yes. So nothing's changed. History is repeating itself. Now, who were these secret societies that were in cahoots with the Templars, or did the Templars control them? Who knows? Let's read about the assassins. Degrees of the assassins was thus as follows. First, there was the Grand Master, known as Sheikh al-Yabal, or Old Man of the Mountain. Second, the Dayal Kerbi, the Grand Priors. Third, the fully initiated Dayas. Fourth, the Rashifs, the Associates. Fifth, the Fadais, devoted. Sixth, the Lasiks, or law brothers. And lastly, the common people, who were to be simply blind instruments. Does it sound familiar? The poor blind Goyim's catechumens. Designs against religion were of course not admitted by the order. Strict uniformity to Islam was demanded from all the lower rank of uninitiated, but the adept was taught to see through the deception of faith and works. So here we have a whole nation's subject to these insiders, using them as human cattle. Wouldn't you feel sorry for them, like we have to feel sorry for ourselves, because we've been duped like that as well? Thus, by the lure of paradise, the assassins enlisted instruments for their criminal work and established a system of organized murder on the basis of religious fervor. Nothing is true and all is allowed was the ground of their secret doctrine. The Jesuits have the same doctrine today, which, however, being imparted but to a few and concealed under the veil of the utmost austere religionism and piety, restrained the mind under the yoke of blind obedience. Poor people, duped by satanic insiders.
So that's Walter Veith there. His talk is entitled The Islamic Connection to Catholicism. Really, he's saying that it was the Vatican that created Islam in order to give an excuse for a fight in the Middle East. So that's a fascinating possibility. Certainly not saying it's true, but yeah, I mean, it explained quite a lot. The idea, of course, was that the Vatican then, after Islam had become established, set up this thing called the Templars, which was a satanic organisation. It certainly was proved to be so, and people say that it was only through torture that the Templars confessed to these satanic rites. But actually, there were quite a few Templars who left the Templars and gave evidence without being tortured, no torture involved at all, about how the thing had become like basically a satanic religious cult. The Knights Templar were known, there was an expression in Britain at the time, in medieval times, when the Templars were thriving, as drunk as a Templar. So they weren't actually really keeping to the religion at all, but they almost saw themselves as gods, the Knights Templar. So, obviously they had to have someone to fight. So maybe the Vatican was involved in that, setting up the Islam in the first place. Who knows? So that, I think, is an interesting talk. So I'll put a full version of that up, as I did last week, on our show page again at thisweek.org.uk. Personally, much prefer David Livingston's take on all this. But anyway, time to sign off now. Thanks to our guest, Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers, and also to Crispin Flintoff from Not the Andrew Marr Show, which is every Sunday morning, and Tim Cohen, author of The Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, speaking to us from the United States. Also, sound engineer Dave Pazanko. You can download our MP3s to listen in the car or anywhere you like. Follow Tony Gosling Censored on Telegram. Do please send me interviews and story tips via Not the BCFM Politics Show page, as a couple of you did this week with that fascinating little clip from Andrew Bridgen. Thank you very much. And you'll also find the podcast, full-length interviews, story links, comment page, and our email addresses, Martin and mine, at thisweek.org.uk. And you can subscribe to my weekly newsletter. It might get to you if you've got a Gmail address, it might not. And you can even donate at thisweek.org.uk. We've been streaming live from the People's Republic of Stokes Croft in Bristol, on the talkradio.org.uk stream, at radioquk.com in Camberley, Surrey, and live on the Not the BCFM Politics Show app. If you can restream us live or rebroadcast us, just let me know and I'll credit you here. Have a relaxing and enjoyable Whitsun Bank Holiday weekend. Do please join us on Not the BCFM Politics Show next Friday at 5. God bless. And don't let the satanic banksters get you down.
Lay about. I ain't nothing but a layabout. I ain't nothing kind of layabout. A 24-hour day, 24 hours a day.
Power belongs in the hands of people.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. We know things are bad, worse than bad. Bad. They're crazy, 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 crazy.
10 seconds to commercial.
Sometimes extreme behavior can be the warning sign of a mental illness. Learn to see the sickness. The
President of the United States!
Regrettably, we now believe that only force will make him leave.
The sickness.
Regrettably,
bloodshed,
we now believe
strife,
that only force
riot
will make him leave.
Right.
I am certain our cause is just, a gallon of gas, and I am certain our cause is moral, loss of life, and I am certain our cause is right.
Give me the goddamn money.
A new world order.
I don't know.
It's going to be all right tonight.
Again.
I'm from the United States of Kiss My Ass.
Stupidity.
Again.
Demonstrations of this kind are demoralizing the whole country.
Corruption.
Again.
Don't hate the media. Become the media.
Power is up to you. Choice is up to you. Change the world is up to you.
Please do your part.
We want to know what the truth is.
Television is not the truth. Television is a goddamn amusement park.
Regrettably, we now believe that only force will make him leave. Regrettably, we now believe that only force will make him leave.
The protesters are a tiny but vocal minority. The American people overwhelmingly support the President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, how do you feel?
Bum, you get a job.
Oh, yeah.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
It's the right thing to do.
It's up to you.
It's the right thing to do.
It's up to you.
How do you feel?
It's the right thing to do.
It's up to you.
It's the right thing to do.
It's up to you.
Let me tell you what it is. Power.
It's up to you. Up to you.
Choice.
It's up to you. Up to you.
Change the world.
It's up to you. Up to you.
Do what's right.
It's up to you.
One more time. Power.
It's up to you.
It's the right thing to do.
Let's hear it.
Choice.
It's up to you.
It's the right thing to do.
How do you feel?
Change the world.
It's up to you.
It's the right thing to do. Do what's It's right. It's up to you. It's the right thing to do. Oh, yeah! What a group of kids we've sent out into the world.
This farce. This 20th century Bastille that pretends to be a pocket democracy. Why don't you put us all into solitary confinement till you get what you're after and have done with it?
That's enough! I call this meeting to order! Look at them. Brainwashed imbeciles. Can you laugh? Can you cry? Can you think? Is this what they did to you? Is this how they tried to break you till they got what they were after? In your heads must still be the remnant of a brain. In your hearts must still be the desire to be a human being again.
This is a most serious breach of etiquette. I'd imagine your desire to stand for election was genuine.
Do you know the way to San Jose? I've been away so long, I may go wrong and lose my way. Do you know the way to San Jose? I'm going back to find some peace of mind in San Jose. LA is a great big freeway. Put 100 down and buy a car. In a week, maybe two, they'll make you a star. Weeks turn into years, how quick they pass. And all the stars that never were are parking cars and pumping gas. You can really breathe in San Jose. They've got a lot of space. There'll be a place where I can stay. I was born and raised in San Jose. I'm going back to find some peace of mind in San Jose. Fame and fortune is a magnet. It can pull you far away from home. With a dream in your heart, you're never alone. Dreams turn into dust and blow away. And there you are, without a friend. You pack your car and ride away. I've got lots of friends in San Jose. Do you know the way to San Jose? Stars that never were are parking cars and pumping gas. I've got lots of friends in San